Imagine a world where World War II ended differently, not with tanks grinding across Europe, but with the roar of jet engines screaming through the sky at speeds no Allied pilot had ever encountered. Picture this. It's 1944. American B-17 bombers approach Berlin in their standard defensive formations. Suddenly, aircraft appear that move faster than anything the bomber crews have seen. No propellers, just sleek shapes accelerating past at 600 miles per hour, firing cannons that rip through aluminum like paper. The escorts, P-51 Mustangs, America's best fighters, try to intercept. They can't catch up. The German jets climb vertically, then dive back through the formation before gunners can track them. Within minutes, a dozen bombers are falling from the sky. This actually happened. The Messerschmitt Me-262, Germany's operational jet fighter, did exactly this in late 1944 and early 1945. Over 1,200 were built. They achieved kill ratios that should have been impossible, 5-to-1, sometimes 10-to-1, against Allied fighters. But here's what most people don't know. The Me-262 wasn't Germany's only jet fighter. It wasn't even their most advanced. Behind the Me-262, hidden in secret workshops across Nazi Germany, were dozens of other jet designs. Some were more advanced, some were faster, some had capabilities that wouldn't be matched for decades. The Heinkel He-280, the world's first jet fighter to fly, a full year before the Me-262, but canceled. The Focke-Wulf Ta-183, a swept-wing design so advanced it influenced jets for the next decade. The Heinkel Ho-162 Volksjäger, designed to be built by unskilled workers and flown by teenagers. The Horten Ho-229, a jet-powered flying wing with stealth characteristics. These are just the ones that reached prototype stage. There were hundreds more that never left the drawing board. Radical designs, brilliant innovations, desperate gambles. This is the story of the forgotten German jet fighters of World War II. The aircraft that could have changed history but didn't. And the uncomfortable question that haunts military historians. What if Germany had prioritized these jets earlier? Could they have stopped the Allied bombing campaign? Could they have prevented D-Day? Could they have changed the outcome of the war? The technology was there. The designs worked. The performance was revolutionary. What Germany lacked wasn't capability, it was time. This is the story of the jets that were forgotten by history but could have changed it. Before we examine the forgotten jets, we need to understand why jets mattered. In 1939, when World War II began, air combat was dominated by piston engine fighters. The Spitfire, the Messerschmitt Bf-109, sophisticated aircraft, but all limited to around 400 miles per hour maximum. Above 25,000 feet, engine power dropped dramatically. Acceleration was limited by propeller efficiency. Jet engines eliminated these limitations. A turbojet provided thrust at any speed, in any direction. Performance at high altitude actually improved. And jets could go fast. 600 miles per hour was achievable. 700 wasn't impossible. This represented fundamental superiority. Speed is life in a dogfight. The faster aircraft controls the engagement. It can attack or disengage at will. Jets versus piston fighters wasn't a fair fight. It was generational technological dominance. The British and Germans both began jet research in the 1930s. Frank Whittle in Britain, Hans von Ohain in Germany. Both understood the potential, but Germany moved faster. The first jet aircraft to fly was the Heinkel He-178 on August 27, 1939, days before the war began. Britain's first jet didn't fly until May 1941, nearly 2 years later, and Britain's first operational jet, the Gloucester Meteor, didn't enter service until July 1944, 9 months after the Me-262. Why did Germany move faster? Greater urgency after the Battle of Britain challenged their air superiority, willingness to take risks on experimental designs, and institutional support. Goering understood jets' potential. By 1942, Germany had multiple jet programs in development. The Me-262 was the most advanced, but dozens of other designs were progressing. The Americans and British knew about German jet development. They were concerned, but assumed the war would be over before German jets could deploy in significant numbers. That assumption was almost wrong. The Me-262 entered service in July 1944. By May 1945, over 1,200 had been built. They achieved remarkable success despite limited numbers and fuel shortages. Allied bomber crews feared them. Fighter pilots couldn't catch them. But the Me-262 wasn't perfect. Long takeoff rolls made it vulnerable. Engines were unreliable, lasting only 25 hours. It required skilled pilots when Germany's experienced pilots were dying faster than they could be replaced. Production was constantly disrupted by Allied bombing. The other German jet programs were attempts to solve these problems. Faster jets, simpler jets, jets built quickly with unskilled labor, jets flown by novice pilots. Some succeeded technically, none succeeded strategically. Let's examine why. April 2nd, 1941. An unfamiliar aircraft takes off from Rostock-Marienhütte airfield in northern Germany. Sleek, twin-engined, with graceful lines and no propeller. Test pilot Fritz Schaefer advances throttles on two He S8 turbojet engines. The Heinkel He 280 lifts into the air. The world's first turbojet fighter is flying. This moment should be famous. It should be in every aviation history book, but it's not. Most people have never heard of the He 280. Despite being first, despite flying well, despite proving the concept, it was canceled. Understanding why the He 280 failed is crucial to understanding why Germany's jet program never reached its potential. Ernst Heinkel was one of Germany's premier aircraft designers. His company built successful Luftwaffe aircraft, including the He 111 bomber. But Heinkel wanted to pioneer jet propulsion. In 1938, before the war started, Heinkel began working on a jet fighter. He collaborated with Hans von Ohain, developing turbojet engines at Heinkel's facility. The goal: create the world's first jet-powered fighter. The He 280 design was remarkably modern. Mid-wing monoplane with retractable tricycle landing gear, unusual as most aircraft used tail wheels. Slender fuselage with pressurized cockpit. Two jet engines mounted under the wings. The layout looks familiar because it became the standard configuration for twin-engine jets. The F-15 Eagle, developed 30 years later, uses essentially the same layout. Heinkel got it right the first time. The first prototype flew as a glider in September 1940 to test aerodynamics. Everything looked good. Then in April 1941, with engines installed, it became the first jet fighter to fly. The performance was impressive. Top speed over 480 miles per hour, faster than any production fighter of 1941. Good handling, responsive controls. The pressurized cockpit allowed comfortable high-altitude flight. It was everything a jet fighter should be. In April 1943, Heinkel arranged a demonstration. The He 280 would race against a Focke-Wulf ww2, Germany's best piston fighter at the time. The result was decisive. The He 280 easily outpaced the ww1 in speed, climb rate, and acceleration. The Luftwaffe observers were impressed. Here was proof that jet fighters were viable and superior to piston fighters. The He 280 should have been ordered into production immediately. But it wasn't. The problem was politics and competition. Messerschmitt was developing the Me-262, and Messerschmitt had better political connections. Willy Messerschmitt had personal relationships with high-ranking Nazis. Ernst Heinkel didn't. Additionally, the He S8 engines weren't reliable enough. They needed development. The Luftwaffe decided to wait for better engines, but by the time better engines were available, the Me-262 program had advanced further and was chosen for production. In March 1943, the He 280 program was canceled. 9 prototypes had been built. The aircraft had proven jet fighters worked, but it would never see production. This was Germany's first critical mistake with jets. The He-280 flew in April 1941. If it had been prioritized and rushed into production, operational jet fighters could have been deployed by late 1942 or early 1943, 2 years earlier than the Me-262. What could Germany have done with jet fighters in 1943? The Allied bombing campaign was ramping up. American B-17s were beginning daylight raids. British bombers conducted night raids. German piston fighters were effective but vulnerable to bomber defensive fire and escort fighters. Jet fighters in 1943 would have been devastating. They could have intercepted bomber formations at high altitude where piston fighters struggled. Their speed would have made them nearly immune to escort fighters. Their heavy armament could have destroyed bombers rapidly. Could this have stopped the Allied bombing campaign? Probably not completely. The Allies had thousands of bombers. But it could have made it far more costly, potentially forcing changes in Allied strategy. Instead, the He-280 was canceled, the prototypes were scrapped, and the world's first jet fighter became a footnote in aviation history. By late 1944, Germany's situation was desperate. The Me-262 was operational but in limited numbers. Allied bombing had devastated German industry. Fuel was scarce. The Luftwaffe was overwhelmed. Focke-Wulf, one of Germany's premier aircraft manufacturers, proposed a radical solution, the Ta-183, a jet fighter designed to be better than the Me-262 in every way: faster, more maneuverable, easier to produce, more fuel efficient. The design was revolutionary. Swept wings, 35 degrees of sweep on the leading edge. A single jet engine mounted in the rear fuselage. T-tail configuration with the horizontal stabilizer mounted atop the vertical fin. Tricycle landing gear, simple, clean lines with minimal drag. This configuration would become standard for jet fighters in the 1950s. The Soviet MiG-15, one of the most successful jet fighters ever built, bears a striking resemblance to the Ta-183. So does the North American F-86 Sabre. These weren't coincidences. When Soviet forces overran Focke-Wulf facilities in 1945, they captured Ta-183 design documents and wind tunnel models. Soviet engineers studied them extensively. The MiG-15, which first flew in 1947, incorporated many Ta-183 design features. American forces also captured 183 documents. American engineers studied them when developing the F-86 Sabre. The swept wing configuration, the engine placement, the overall layout, all influenced by the Ta-183. But in 1944, the Ta-183 was just a proposal. Kurt Tank, Focke-Wulf's chief designer, presented it to the Luftwaffe in autumn 1944. The projected performance was extraordinary. Over 600 miles per hour at sea level, excellent maneuverability, heavily armed with 4 30mm cannons. Most importantly, it was designed for rapid production, simple construction, minimal machining, materials that were still available despite shortages. A semi-skilled worker could assemble it in a fraction of the time required for a Me-262. The Luftwaffe approved the design in December 1944. Prototypes were ordered. Production was planned to begin in mid-1945. But by mid-1945, Germany had surrendered. The Ta-183 never flew. Only wooden mock-ups and wind tunnel models were completed. Yet its influence was profound. Post-war, both American and Soviet jet fighter designs drew heavily on Ta-183 concepts. The swept wing configuration became standard. The single-engine, rear-mounted layout was widely adopted. The clean aerodynamics influenced jet design philosophy. The Ta-183 represents what German jet development could have achieved with more time. It was a second-generation jet fighter design, incorporating lessons from the Me-262 and pushing performance even further. If Germany had prioritized jet development earlier, if resources had been allocated differently, if political interference had been minimal, Designs like the Ta-183 could have been operational by 1944. Combined with early deployment of jets like the He-280, Germany could have fielded a jet fighter force significantly more capable than anything the Allies had. Would this have changed the war's outcome? Almost certainly not. Germany was losing for strategic reasons far beyond air superiority, but it would have made victory far more costly for the Allies. September 1944. Germany is losing the war. Allied armies are advancing from all directions. The Luftwaffe is being destroyed. Planes are being shot down faster than they can be replaced, and experienced pilots are dying. The Me-262 is operational, but in limited numbers. It's complex to build, requires scarce materials, and needs skilled pilots. Germany needs a simpler solution, something that can be built quickly with minimal resources, something that can be flown by minimally trained pilots. The answer is the Volksjäger, the people's fighter. The specification is desperate. Design a jet fighter that can be built by semi-skilled workers using non-strategic materials, assembled in small workshops dispersed across Germany to avoid bombing, and flown by Hitler Youth members with basic training. Heinkel responds with the He-162. The design is radical in its simplicity. A small, lightweight airframe, a single BMW 003 turbojet mounted on top of the fuselage, just behind the cockpit. Straight wings for easy construction. Fixed landing gear wells to simplify manufacturing. The entire aircraft is designed to be built from wood, steel tubing, and minimal aluminum. No complex curves, no sophisticated systems, just the absolute minimum required to get a jet engine, a pilot, and 2 cannons into the air. From design approval to first flight, an astonishing 69 days. On December 6, 1944, the first He-162 prototype takes to the air. It flies reasonably well, though it's clearly temperamental and challenging to control. 4 days later, the prototype crashes during a demonstration flight, killing the test pilot. Investigation reveals the wooden wing structure failed. The adhesive used couldn't handle the stress. This should have ended the program. It didn't. Germany was too desperate. The design was modified with stronger wing construction, and testing continued. Production began in early 1945 using dispersed manufacturing. Components were built in various locations, some in underground factories, some in workshops hidden in forests, then assembled at final assembly sites. By war's end, about 300 He-162s had been completed, with hundreds more in various stages of assembly. But there was a fatal flaw in the entire concept: the pilots. The He-162 was supposed to be flown by Hitler Youth volunteers with minimal training. The idea was that young Germans, indoctrinated with Nazi ideology and desperate to defend the fatherland, would volunteer for suicide missions essentially, fly the difficult jet fighter against overwhelming odds with minimal survival chances. The problem was that the He-162, despite its simplicity compared to the Me-262, was still a jet fighter. It was fast, touchy on the controls, and unforgiving of pilot error. Flying it required skill and experience. Throwing teenagers with basic flying training into combat in this aircraft was murder. A few operational units were formed in early 1945. Some He-162s flew combat missions, but their impact was negligible. Most were destroyed on the ground by Allied bombing. Many crashed due to pilot error or mechanical failure. The few that engaged Allied aircraft had mixed results. The jet was capable when flown well, but most pilots didn't fly it well. The Volksjäger concept represented the ultimate desperation. Build cheap fighters. Throw minimally trained children into them. Hope they somehow stop the Allied air armada through sheer numbers and fanatical courage. It was doomed from the start, but it's a powerful reminder of how desperate Germany had become by late 1944. They were willing to sacrifice their own youth in poorly conceived suicide attacks. The He-162 wasn't a weapon of war. It was evidence of a regime's death throes. Yet technically, the He-162 was impressive. For an aircraft designed and built in months using non-strategic materials, it performed remarkably well. Top speed over 500 miles per hour, good rate of climb, acceptable handling for experienced pilots. If the He-162 had been developed earlier, say 1943, and produced in large numbers with a proper pilot training program, it could have been effective. Not as a replacement for the Me-262, but as a complement. The Me-262 for elite units with experienced pilots, the He-162 for standard units with average pilots. But by the time the He-162 flew, it was far too late. While most German jet development focused on fighters, there was one jet bomber that actually saw significant operational use, the Arado R-234 Blitz. The R-234 was the world's first operational jet bomber. It first flew in June 1943 and entered service in autumn 1944. Its performance was extraordinary. Maximum speed over 460 miles per hour, making it faster than any Allied fighter. The design was sleek, twin Jumo 004 engines mounted under a high wing, long, narrow fuselage, pressurized cockpit with excellent visibility. Initially equipped with a trolley takeoff system and skid landing gear to save weight, later versions had conventional landing gear. The R-234's primary role was reconnaissance. Its speed made it nearly impossible to intercept. It could fly over Allied positions, photograph them, and escape before fighters could climb to intercept. The intelligence gathered was valuable. But the AR-234 could also carry bombs, up to 3,000 pounds. As a bomber, it was revolutionary. Traditional bombers flew in formation for mutual defense, accepting losses from fighters and flak. The R-234 flew alone, relying on speed for defense. Allied fighters couldn't catch it. Flak couldn't track it effectively. During the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, R-234s conducted bombing raids against Allied positions. The raids were small, only a handful of aircraft, but demonstrated the concept. A fast jet bomber could strike targets and escape with minimal risk. By war's end, about 200 R-234s had been built. Operational units conducted missions until Germany surrendered. Some R-234s were captured intact and studied extensively by Allied intelligence. The R-234 proved jet bombers were viable. It influenced post-war bomber development in both America and the Soviet Union. The concept of high-speed, high-altitude jet bombers dominating the skies traces back to the R-234. But imagine if the R-234 had been operational in 1942 or 1943, before Allied air superiority was established. Before D-Day, hundreds of fast jet bombers striking Allied positions, supply lines, and airfields with impunity. It wouldn't have changed strategic realities. Germany was losing for reasons beyond tactical air superiority, but it would have complicated Allied planning significantly. The forgotten German jets all share a common tragedy. They arrived too late. The He-280 flew in April 1941 but was canceled instead of produced. If operational by 1942, it could have challenged Allied bombing campaigns early. The Te-183 was designed in late 1944 when Germany had months left. If developed in 1942, it could have been operational by 1943 or 1944 with devastating effect. The He-162 was rushed into production in desperation in late 1944. If designed properly in 1942 with adequate development time, it could have been an effective mass production fighter. The R-234 entered service in autumn 1944. If operational in 1942, it could have seriously complicated Allied operations. Why didn't this happen? Why didn't Germany prioritize jets earlier? Several reasons. First, early war success bred complacency. After victories in Poland, France, and the early Soviet campaign, German leadership didn't feel urgency for revolutionary weapons. Conventional aircraft seemed adequate. Second, Hitler's interference. He repeatedly demanded bombers instead of fighters, delaying fighter programs. When he finally saw the Me-262, he insisted it be used as a bomber, further delaying its fighter deployment. Third, resource allocation. Germany was fighting on multiple fronts. Resources were spread thin. Jets required scarce materials and skilled labor. Conventional aircraft were proven and easier to produce. Fourth, intercompany rivalry. Messerschmitt, Heinkel, Focke-Wulf, and others competed for contracts. Political connections mattered more than technical merit. The best designs didn't always win. Fifth, Allied bombing. As German industrial capacity was destroyed, jet production became impossible regardless of design quality. The result was that German jets arrived piecemeal, in limited numbers, too late to matter strategically. But what if circumstances had been different? What if Germany had recognized the importance of jets in 1940? What if resources had been allocated properly? What if Hitler hadn't interfered? Imagine this scenario. Germany prioritizes jet development in 1940. The He-280 enters production in 1941. By mid-1942, several hundred jet fighters are operational. Allied bombing campaigns suffer catastrophic losses. Plans for D-Day must be reconsidered due to German air superiority over France. Would Germany have won the war? Number. Strategic realities, Soviet manpower and resources, American industrial capacity, British determination would still favor the Allies. But victory would have been far more costly and possibly delayed by years. This is why the forgotten German jets matter. They represent how close technological superiority came to compensating for strategic failure. They show how a 2-year head start in jets could have changed the calculus of war. They didn't change his Tory, but they could have. The forgotten German jet fighters of World War II represent one of history's great what-ifs. The technology was there. The He-280 proved in 1941 that jet fighters were viable. The Ta-183 proved that second-generation jets with swept wings and advanced aerodynamics could be designed. The He-162 proved that jets could be built simply and quickly. The AR-234 proved that jet bombers were revolutionarily effective. But they came too late. By the time German jets reached operational status in significant numbers, the war was already lost. Germany was being bombed relentlessly, invaded from all sides, running out of fuel and materials and trained personnel. The jets were brilliant engineering achievements created in service of a monstrous regime. We can admire the technology while condemning the purposes it served. These aircraft were designed to extend a genocidal war, to kill Allied personnel fighting to defeat fascism, yet they influenced the future of aviation profoundly. The MiG-15, modeled after the Ta-183, became one of the most successful jets ever built. The F-86 Sabre incorporated German swept-wing research. American and Soviet jet development built on German innovations. The forgotten German jets changed the future even though they didn't change World War II. The lesson is both technical and strategic. Technologically, these aircraft demonstrated that revolutionary innovation is possible even under desperate circumstances. Strategically, they proved that technology alone can't overcome fundamental weaknesses in resources, industrial capacity, and strategic positioning. Germany lost World War II not because they lacked technology. They had some of the most advanced weapons in the world. They lost because they started a war against enemies with overwhelming advantages in manpower, resources, and industrial capacity. No amount of technological brilliance could overcome those realities. The forgotten German jets remain forgotten not because they weren't important, but because they didn't matter strategically. History remembers winners and war-winning weapons. The German jets were neither, but for aviation enthusiasts, engineers, and military historians, They're endlessly fascinating. They represent the cutting edge of 1940s aerospace technology. They show what was possible with limited resources and unlimited ingenuity. And they answer the question, could jets have changed World War II? Yes, if they'd come earlier, if they'd been prioritized, if circumstances had been different, but they didn't. And history unfolded as it did. The forgotten jets remain frozen in history. Brilliant designs that came too late, influenced the future profoundly, but didn't change their own present. That's their legacy, not as weapons that won battles, but as innovations that shaped the jet age.
November 23, 1944. A Belgian farmer working his field near the village of Kortenberg hears the unmistakable sound of aircraft engines. He looks up expecting to see another formation of Allied bombers returning from Germany.
But this plane is alone, and something is wrong. The B-17 Flying Fortress drops from the clouds, landing gear down, flaps extended. It's making a perfect approach to his field, smooth, controlled, professional. The massive bomber touches down, bounces once, rolls across the muddy field, and comes to a gentle stop about 50 yards from where the farmer stands frozen in shock. The engines don't shut down. All 4 propellers continue spinning at idle. The bomber just sits there, engines running, as if waiting for something. The farmer waits for the crew to emerge. Nobody does. He walks closer, shouting in Flemish. No response. He circles the aircraft, looking for signs of life through the windows. Nothing. Just the steady drone of those 4 Wright Cyclone engines turning over. Minutes pass. The farmer's neighbors arrive, drawn by the sound of the aircraft. A local priest, members of the Belgian resistance. They all approach cautiously. Still no movement from inside the bomber. Finally, one of the resistance fighters climbs up through the belly hatch. He moves through the aircraft, checking each crew position. The cockpit, the navigator's station, the radio operator's position, the bomb bay, the waist gun positions, the tail, empty, completely empty, no crew, no bodies, no blood, no signs of struggle. But everything else is there. The engines are warm and running smoothly. Coffee in a thermos is still hot. Half-eaten sandwiches sit on the navigator's table. Charts are spread out showing the route. The radio is on, crackling with static. Personal effects are scattered around crew positions. Photos, letters, a Bible. It looks like the crew stepped out for a moment, like they're coming right back. But they never do. 10 men had vanished from a flying aircraft, and the bomber had landed itself. This is the true story of the B-17 Ghost Bomber, the aircraft that completed a mission with no one at the controls, the mystery that has baffled investigators for 80 years, and one of the strangest, most unsettling incidents in World War II history. What happened to that crew? Where did they go? And how did a 4-engine bomber execute a perfect landing with nobody flying it? Welcome to the creepiest mission of World War II. Act 1. The Phantom Fortress. The bomber sitting in that Belgian field was a B-17G Flying Fortress, serial number 42-97690. No nickname painted on the nose, no distinctive nose art. Just another flying fortress in a fleet of thousands. But this particular aircraft had a good service record. 142 combat missions completed. No aborts. No major mechanical issues. Ground crews considered it reliable. Pilots trusted it. It was the kind of aircraft that brought crews home. The B-17 Flying Fortress was the backbone of American daylight bombing over Europe. 4 Wright R-1820 Cyclone engines, each producing 1,200 horsepower, wingspan of 103 feet, 13.50 caliber machine guns for defense, bomb capacity of 4,800 pounds. A fortress because it could take tremendous damage and keep flying. By November 1944, the Allied bombing campaign was crushing Germany's industrial capacity. Thousands of bombers flew daily missions, escorted by long-range fighters. The Luftwaffe was weakening, but the missions were still dangerous. Flak still filled the skies, German fighters still attacked, bombers still went down. On November 23, 1944, this particular B-17 took off from an airfield in England as part of a larger formation heading to Germany. The target was a synthetic oil refinery, a strategic target that, if destroyed, would further cripple Germany's fuel supplies. The crew that morning was a composite team, not a regular crew that had trained and flown together, but men pulled from different squadrons to fill out the roster. This was common by late 1944. Casualties, injuries, and rotation schedules meant crews were often mixed. The pilot was First Lieutenant Harold R. DeBolt, 24 years old, from Kansas. Experienced. 43 combat missions completed. Considered reliable and level-headed by his squadron commander. The co-pilot was Second Lieutenant John R. Miller, 22, from Pennsylvania. Less experienced but competent. His training records were solid. The rest of the crew, navigator, bombardier, flight engineer, radio operator, and 4 gunners. 10 men total, all experienced to varying degrees. All professionals doing a dangerous job. The mission briefing was routine. Weather over the target was expected to be clear. Fighter escort would be provided. Flak was anticipated to be heavy but manageable. Standard risks for a late 1944 bombing mission. At 8:45 hours, the bombers took off and formed up into their combat boxes, the defensive formations that maximized mutual fire support while minimizing vulnerability to fighters. Tail number 42-97690 took its position in the formation. Everything was normal. The flight across the channel was uneventful. The formation climbed to bombing altitude, around 25,000 feet, and proceeded toward Germany. Radio chatter was routine. All aircraft reported systems functioning normally. Then, somewhere over Germany, something happened to tail number 42-97690. Act 2. The Last Known Moments. The exact sequence of events will never be fully known because the crew disappeared, but we can piece together what likely happened from witness accounts and the physical evidence. At approximately 11:47 hours, as the formation approached the target area, other pilots noticed tail number 42-97690 beginning to drift from formation. Not dramatically, just a slight movement left, then a correction back. The kind of thing that happens when a pilot adjusts for wind or momentary inattention. Then it happened again. A more pronounced drift this time. Captain Gerald F. Stewart, flying the B-17 directly behind tail number 42-97690, noticed the erratic movement. He radioed, "690, you're drifting. Check your position." No response. He tried again. 690, this is Stewart. You're sliding out of formation. What's your status? Still no response. Now other pilots were noticing. The B-17 was steadily, gradually falling back from the formation. Not diving, not in obvious distress, just leaving. Like someone had decided to turn around and go home. Stewart tried once more. 690, if you're aborting, acknowledge and state reason. Silence. The aircraft continued its turn away from the formation, heading west, back toward Allied territory. The flight was smooth, controlled. Everything about the aircraft's behavior suggested it was under control. But there was no radio communication, no flares fired to signal distress, no visual signals from the crew. The formation couldn't break up to follow. They had a target to hit. They had to maintain position. So they watched as tail number 42-97690 disappeared into the distance, heading west, apparently flying normally. That was the last time anyone in the bombing formation saw the aircraft in flight. But now the story gets stranger, because British radar stations tracked the bomber as it flew west across Germany into Allied-controlled Belgium. The radar returns showed normal flight, steady altitude, consistent speed, controlled trajectory. Nothing that indicated distress or mechanical failure. Ground observers in liberated areas of Belgium spotted the B-17 flying overhead. Several reported seeing it. A four-engine bomber flying alone wasn't unusual. Damaged aircraft often limped home individually. But this bomber showed no signs of damage. No smoke, no visible battle damage. It was flying perfectly normally. At approximately 12:30 hours, the bomber began descending. Not an emergency descent. A controlled, gradual descent, like a pilot preparing to land. A British anti-aircraft unit near Mechelen spotted it and tracked it through binoculars, ready to engage if it proved hostile. But the markings were clearly American. The aircraft was obviously Allied. They held their fire. The crew watched as the bomber made a wide, sweeping turn, as if the pilot was surveying the landscape below, looking for a place to land. Then it lined up with an open field near Kortenberg. Not an airfield, just a farm field. But it was flat and long enough for a landing if you were desperate. The landing gear came down, the flaps extended, every step of a proper landing sequence executed correctly. The bomber descended smoothly, touched down gently, rolled across the field, and came to a stop. The British crew expected to see the American crew emerge. Maybe they were wounded. Maybe they'd suffered oxygen deprivation and were disoriented. Maybe they'd been forced to land due to mechanical issues they couldn't communicate. But nobody got out. The engines kept running, the propellers kept spinning, and the bomber just sat there in the field waiting. That's when the Belgian farmer approached. That's when the resistance fighters arrived. That's when they climbed inside and found the aircraft empty. 10 men gone, without a trace. Act 3. The investigation begins. Within hours, U.S. Army Air Force investigators arrived at the scene. This wasn't just unusual, this was unprecedented. An aircraft landing itself was impossible. There had to be an explanation. Major Thomas Stanton led the investigation. He was thorough, methodical, and experienced in crash investigations. But this wasn't a crash. This was something he'd never seen. The first priority was documenting everything exactly as found. Photographers took hundreds of pictures. Every detail was noted. Every item in the aircraft was catalogued. Because Stanton realized immediately that this was extraordinary. The aircraft was in excellent condition. The engines, when inspected, were running smoothly with no mechanical issues. Fuel tanks were checked, still over 40% full, plenty of fuel remaining. No battle damage, no flak holes, no bullet impacts. The aircraft was structurally perfect. The landing gear had been lowered manually. The investigators could see the indicators. The flaps were extended to landing configuration. The throttles were set to idle. The mixture controls were set correctly. Every switch and control was in the proper position for landing. This wasn't a case of autopilot malfunction. B-17S had autopilots that could maintain altitude and heading, but they couldn't lower landing gear, extend flaps, or execute landing procedures. That required human input. Someone had flown this aircraft to Belgium and landed it. But who? The crew positions told disturbing stories in their details. In the cockpit, the pilot's seat was adjusted to a position consistent with someone of Lieutenant de Bolt's height. The control yoke showed finger impressions in the dust that had settled on it. Someone had been holding it recently, but the throttles were set to idle, as if the pilot had reduced power for landing, then left. The navigator station showed charts spread out with a course plotted. The route drawn on the map showed the planned bombing run, but also a return course heading west toward England. Someone had been navigating. Someone had plotted a course home. The pencil that had drawn those lines lay next to the charts. The radio operator's position had the radio set to the correct frequencies. The last logged transmission was the unanswered calls from Captain Stewart asking about their status. The operator had been there, had been monitoring, then wasn't. At the bombardier's position, the bomb site was uncovered. The bombs, this was crucial, had never been loaded. This was sometimes done on certain types of missions where the primary goal was reconnaissance, or when bomb loads were being conserved, so the aircraft was never intended to drop bombs on this mission. The most unsettling details were the personal items. A thermos of coffee, still warm, in the cockpit. When investigators opened it, steam rose. The coffee had been poured within the last hour or two. Half-eaten K rations at various crew positions, a cigarette in an ashtray burned down to the filter, letters from home tucked into a jacket pocket hanging on a hook. A pocket watch stopped at 12:17, roughly consistent with the landing time. Everything suggested the crew had been there, recently, then suddenly wasn't. The parachutes were the detail that eliminated the most obvious theory. All 10 parachutes were accounted for, still neatly stowed in their proper racks. If the crew had bailed out, the standard emergency procedure, they would have taken their parachutes. You don't jump from a B-17 at altitude without a parachute unless you want to die. But all the parachutes were there, which meant the crew hadn't bailed out, or if they had, they'd done so without parachutes, which was suicidal. Major Stanton interviewed every witness who'd seen the aircraft. The radar operators confirmed continuous tracking from over Germany to the landing site. No breaks in the signal, no indication of structural failure, just smooth, controlled flight. The British anti-aircraft crew confirmed watching the landing approach. They'd had the aircraft in sight for several minutes. They were adamant. The landing sequence was normal, professional, controlled. Whoever was flying knew what they were doing. The Belgian farmer and resistance fighters who'd first reached the aircraft all confirmed the same thing. Engines running, nobody visible inside, no signs of struggle or emergency. Stanton's preliminary investigation revealed no obvious explanation. The aircraft was mechanically sound. The flight path suggested skilled piloting. The landing was textbook perfect. But there was no crew. He expanded the investigation. Had the crew bailed out over Germany? Search and rescue operations over the known flight path found nothing. No parachutes, no bodies, no reports from German authorities of captured airmen. Had they landed somewhere else first, then taken off again? No. The fuel consumption was consistent with a single flight from England to Belgium, and there were no reports of B-17s landing at any Allied airfields in the hours before the Belgian landing. Had they been abducted somehow? By who? How? There were no signs of forced entry, no indication anyone besides the crew had been in the aircraft. Every theory had fatal flaws, and the most disturbing fact remained. Someone had flown that aircraft to Belgium and landed it, but no one was there. Act 4. The Theories. In the days and weeks following the incident, various theories emerged trying to explain what happened. None were entirely satisfactory. Theory 1. Mass oxygen deprivation. B-17S flew at 25,000 feet where the air is too thin to breathe. Crews relied on oxygen systems. If the oxygen failed, the crew would gradually lose consciousness. Perhaps the oxygen system failed, everyone passed out, and in their hypoxic confusion, the crew believed they needed to evacuate the aircraft. They opened the bomb bay doors and fell out without parachutes, not realizing what they were doing. Meanwhile, the aircraft, on autopilot, continued flying. By pure chance, it happened to descend over flat terrain. The landing gear might have deployed through mechanical failure or partial crew action before consciousness was lost. The aircraft, guided by luck and aerodynamics, landed itself. Problems with this theory. Oxygen system failure affects people gradually. Someone would have noticed and alerted others. The oxygen system was inspected post-landing and showed no failures. Most critically, the landing sequence required multiple deliberate actions that autopilot couldn't perform. Gear down, flaps extended, power reduced. These required human input. Theory 2. Collective bailout due to perceived emergency. Perhaps the crew experienced what they believed was a catastrophic emergency, maybe a fire warning, structural damage indication, or other alarm. In panic, they bailed out without following proper procedures. The aircraft, lighter without crew, managed to continue flying. Again, by extraordinary coincidence, it descended and landed itself through a combination of autopilot, trim settings, and aerodynamic factors. Problems. There was no emergency. Post-landing inspection found no fire, no structural damage, no malfunctions that would trigger emergency bailout. The crew were experienced. They wouldn't panic and bail without parachutes. And again, the landing sequence required deliberate human actions. Theory 3. Secret mission gone wrong. Perhaps this wasn't a standard bombing mission. Perhaps the crew was involved in something classified, dropping agents, special reconnaissance, something requiring radio silence and unusual procedures. Something went wrong. The crew had to evacuate quickly for reasons that remain classified. The aircraft was pre-programmed somehow to land itself at a predetermined location. The mystery persists because the true mission remains classified 80 years later. Problems. There's no evidence of classified operations. The mission records show a standard bombing assignment. The aircraft carried no special equipment beyond normal B-17 systems, and pre-programming a 1944 aircraft to land itself autonomously was technologically impossible. Theory 4. Crew capture after landing. Perhaps the crew did land the aircraft normally. They got out. Then, before witnesses arrived, they were captured or killed by someone. German infiltrators, criminals, even other Allied forces in a case of mistaken identity. The captors removed the bodies and all evidence. Problems. The Belgian resistance arrived quickly. The time window was perhaps 15 minutes. Removing 10 bodies and all evidence in 15 minutes is unlikely. The area was under Allied control. German infiltrators would have been detected. And why would anyone capture the crew but leave the aircraft intact? Theory 5. Deliberate disappearance. Perhaps the crew deliberately disappeared. They landed, abandoned the aircraft, and fled for reasons unknown. Desertion, espionage, some personal crisis that drove them to vanish. Problems. 10 men disappearing simultaneously is extraordinarily unlikely. Desertion is a capital offense. They'd be hunted. Where would they go? How would they survive in occupied territory? And why leave all their personal effects? Theory 6. Time anomaly. The most speculative theory? The crew experienced some kind of temporal anomaly. They were displaced in time or space while the aircraft remained and landed itself through unknown means. This is science fiction, not investigation. But it's been proposed because it's hard to explain the physical evidence any other way. None of these theories fully explain what happened. Each has elements that fit and elements that don't. The truth is probably simpler than a time anomaly, but stranger than any conventional explanation. Act 5. The Witness Testimonies. The investigation took an interesting turn when investigators began interviewing crew members from other aircraft in the formation. Several provided testimony that, while not conclusive, added disturbing details. Captain Gerald Stewart, who'd been flying directly behind tail number 42-97690, was interviewed extensively. His account is the most detailed because he'd been watching the aircraft closely after it began drifting from formation. According to Stewart, the aircraft began drifting maybe 10-15 minutes before it broke away completely. I called on radio, got no response. I was maybe 50 yards behind, slightly above. I could see into the cockpit clearly enough. The interviewer asked what he saw. This is where it gets strange. The pilot seats looked empty. I mean, I know someone had to be flying it. The aircraft was maneuvering, but from my angle, I couldn't see anyone in the seats. Maybe they were slumped forward. Maybe the angle was wrong. But it looked empty. This testimony was initially discounted as combat stress or visual error, but it was corroborated by another pilot, Lieutenant James McCarthy, who'd also been in formation nearby. McCarthy's statement: I saw 690 turn away. I looked at the cockpit through binoculars, trying to see if the pilot was signaling distress. The cockpit looked dark, empty. I couldn't see anyone. I thought maybe the crew was unconscious from oxygen loss. But then the aircraft executed a deliberate turn. Someone had to be flying it. A third witness, a waist gunner in another aircraft, reported seeing 690 through his gun sight. His testimony: I tracked it for maybe 30 seconds as it fell back. I was looking for damage, fire, holes, anything that explained why it was leaving formation. The aircraft looked fine, but I couldn't see crew movement. The waist gun windows looked empty. That's unusual. Usually you see movement, even just shadows. This was still. These testimonies raised a disturbing possibility. The aircraft may have been flying with no visible crew for some time before landing, but this created more questions than answers. If there was no crew, what was flying the aircraft? If there was a crew but they weren't visible, why not? Belgian witnesses who'd seen the landing provided additional details. The priest, Father Maurice Dermont, who'd reached the aircraft shortly after landing, gave this statement. The engines were running when we arrived. 4 engines, all turning smoothly. I expected to see injured men, perhaps. Or maybe they would emerge as we approached. But nothing. The aircraft sat there, alive with sound but empty of people. It was profoundly unsettling. A resistance fighter, Jean-Baptiste Dubois, was the first to enter the aircraft. His account: I climbed through the belly hatch. I called out. No response. I moved through the aircraft, every station empty. But it didn't feel abandoned. It felt recently occupied, like they'd just stepped away. The coffee was warm. I touched it, still hot enough to drink. That frightened me more than anything. Where had they gone? The British anti-aircraft crew who'd watched the landing approach provided technical details that aviation investigators found significant. Sergeant Thomas Whitmore, who'd tracked the aircraft through binoculars during the final approach. The landing was perfect. Textbook. Gear down at the right time. Flaps extended properly. The descent rate was controlled. Whoever was flying knew exactly what they were doing. This wasn't an aircraft barely holding together. This was a skilled pilot landing normally. His commanding officer, Lieutenant Henry Ashford, added, We kept expecting to see the crew emerge. We watched through binoculars as the aircraft stopped. The engines kept running, we could hear them clearly. But no one got out. We waited perhaps 10 minutes before the locals arrived. Nobody appeared in that entire time. It was as if the aircraft landed itself, which we know is impossible. Act 6. The Cold Case. The investigation officially concluded in early 1945 with no definitive explanation. Major Stanton's final report was carefully worded. The circumstances surrounding the disappearance of the crew from B-17 serial number 42-97690 remain unexplained. The aircraft shows no signs of mechanical failure, combat damage, or emergency conditions that would necessitate crew evacuation. The landing was executed professionally, requiring deliberate pilot input. The absence of the crew, combined with the presence of all parachutes, personal effects, and still warm food and drink, creates an inexplicable situation. Further investigation has revealed no evidence of crew bailout, capture, desertion, or foul play. The aircraft has been recovered for detailed technical examination. The crew is officially listed as missing in action, presumed deceased. The families of the 10 crew members received the standard notification: missing in action, not killed in action, not captured, missing. The uncertainty was agonizing. Families waited for word that never came. Some held out hope for years that their sons or husbands would return with an explanation. They never did. After the war, when prisoners were repatriated and missing persons cases were reviewed, none of the 10 crew members from that flight were found. They had simply vanished on November 23, 1944, and were never seen again. The aircraft itself was studied extensively. Engineers examined every system. They ran tests. They tried to recreate scenarios where autopilot and trim settings could result in a controlled landing without human input. They couldn't. The B-17's autopilot could maintain altitude and heading. With proper trim, it might even maintain a gentle descent. But lowering landing gear, extending flaps, adjusting throttles, flaring before touchdown, these required deliberate actions. No combination of autopilot settings and mechanical failures could replicate the landing that witnesses described. The aircraft was eventually returned to service. After extensive inspection confirmed it was mechanically sound, it was assigned to another crew and flew several more missions before the war ended. It survived until 1947, when it was scrapped along with thousands of other surplus wartime aircraft. But the mystery never died. Over the decades, various researchers and aviation historians have investigated the case. Each generation of researchers has applied new analytical techniques and perspectives. None have solved it. In the 1960s, when aviation had advanced significantly, aerospace engineers reviewed the case. Could the B-17 have landed itself through some aerodynamic phenomenon not understood in 1944? The consensus: no. The actions required for landing were too deliberate and sequential to be explained by mechanical chance. In the 1980s, psychological researchers examined whether mass hysteria or oxygen deprivation could explain crew behavior that led to coordinated evacuation without parachutes. They concluded, highly unlikely. The crew were experienced professionals who wouldn't all succumb to panic simultaneously. In the 2000s, when GPS and detailed terrain mapping became available, researchers tried to identify if the aircraft could have crashed in the ocean or remote terrain, with the Belgian landing being a different aircraft. Records conclusively prove it was the same aircraft. Tail numbers, maintenance logs, and witness continuity confirm it. The case remains open in the sense that no official explanation has ever been accepted as definitive. It's listed in various military aviation anomaly databases. It's studied in aviation safety courses as an example of unexplained incidents. And it continues to fascinate anyone who encounters it. Act 7. Similar cases. What makes the B-17 Ghost bomber even more unsettling is that it's not entirely unique. There are other cases, rare but documented, of aircraft behaving in ways that seem impossible or crews disappearing under mysterious circumstances. On March 18, 1944, a B-25 Mitchell bomber took off from Italy heading north. Radio contact was normal initially, then ceased. The aircraft was tracked on radar, then disappeared from scopes. Weeks later, the aircraft was found intact in a remote alpine valley. No crew. No sign of crash damage. The aircraft had apparently landed or crashed in a way that left it largely intact, but the crew had vanished. No bodies were ever found. On August 12, 1942, a B-24 Liberator on patrol from North Africa lost contact with base. It was tracked on radar until it suddenly vanished from screens. No distress call, no wreckage ever found. The aircraft and its crew simply disappeared. This case is usually attributed to catastrophic structural failure over the ocean, but no debris was ever recovered. On September 5, 1943, a B-17 over the North Sea radioed that it was returning to base due to engine trouble. The crew sounded calm. The aircraft was tracked coming back. Then, mid-flight, it vanished from radar. No mayday, no explosion, no wreckage, gone. These cases differ in details from the Belgian ghost bomber, but they share a common element: aircraft and crews disappearing in ways that don't fit normal crash or combat loss patterns. Post-war civilian aircraft have had similar mysteries. The most famous is Frederick Valentich, a pilot who disappeared over Australia in 1978 after radioing about a strange craft following him. His aircraft was never found. While not directly comparable to the World War II cases, it shares the element of a pilot and aircraft vanishing without explanation. What these cases suggest is that aviation, particularly in its early decades, involved phenomena and risks we still don't fully understand. The ghost bomber wasn't an isolated incident. It was the most dramatic example of a category of unexplained disappearances that have occurred throughout aviation history. Asked 8. The human element. Behind the mystery are 10 men whose fates remain unknown. They deserve more than just being a mystery. They deserve to be remembered as people. First Lieutenant Harold DeBolt, the pilot, was from Wichita, Kansas. He'd joined the Army Air Force in 1942, trained as a pilot, and deployed to Europe in early 1944. His letters home, preserved by his family, show a young man who missed home but was committed to doing his duty. His last letter, written the day before the flight, mentioned nothing unusual. He wrote about the weather, asked about his younger brother, and said he'd write again in a few days. He never got the chance. Second Lieutenant John Miller, the co-pilot, was from Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. He'd wanted to be a pilot since childhood. His mother saved his letters, which spoke of his excitement at flying, his respect for the B-17, and his hope the war would end soon so he could come home. His last letter mentioned plans for Thanksgiving. The flight was scheduled for November 23rd, the day before Thanksgiving. He was planning to celebrate with his crew the next day. The navigator, bombardier, engineer, radio operator, and gunners each had their own stories. Families, hopes, plans for after the war. Some were married. Some had children who never knew their fathers. All of them were doing a dangerous job in a terrible war, and they disappeared in a way that gave their families no closure. The families spent years hoping for news. The official MIA designation meant they couldn't grieve properly. There was always the chance their loved ones would return. After the war, when POWs were repatriated and final accounting was done, the families learned what investigators already knew. Their men weren't coming back. But without bodies, without confirmed deaths, without any explanation, the grief remained complicated. How do you mourn someone who simply vanished? How do you explain to a child that their father went to work one day and nobody knows what happened to him? Some families eventually held memorial services, needing closure even without confirmation. Others never gave up hope entirely. There are grandchildren alive today who never met their grandfathers and grew up with the story of the ghost bomber, a family mystery that's also a historical mystery. Conclusion. November 23, 1944. 10 men took off in a B-17 Flying Fortress on what should have been a routine bombing mission. Hours later, their aircraft landed itself in a Belgian field, engines running, systems functioning, the smell of warm coffee in the cockpit. The men were gone. Never found. Never explained. 80 years later, the B-17 Ghost Bomber remains one of World War II's most baffling mysteries. Every investigation has reached the same conclusion. We don't know what happened. Every theory has fatal flaws. Every explanation leaves questions unanswered. What we know for certain is limited. The aircraft took off with 10 men aboard. It left formation over Germany. It flew to Belgium under someone's control. It landed expertly. And when it was found, there was nobody inside. What we don't know is everything that matters. Where did the crew go? What happened in those hours between leaving formation and landing? Did they bail out for reasons unknown? Were they removed from the aircraft by means we can't explain? Did something occur that's beyond our current understanding of aviation and human disappearance? The ghost bomber forces us to confront the limits of knowledge. Sometimes, even with physical evidence, witness testimony, and thorough investigation, we simply can't explain what happened. The universe occasionally presents us with genuine mysteries. This isn't a ghost story, despite the name. It's a documented case of an aircraft landing itself and a crew disappearing without trace. It's unsettling precisely because it's real. Something impossible happened, and we have no explanation. The families of those 10 men deserved answers. They never got them. The crew members themselves deserve to be remembered, not as a mystery, but as people. Harold DeBolt, John Miller, and 8 others who served their country and vanished into history. Maybe someday, evidence will emerge that explains what happened. Maybe a diary will be found, or documents will be declassified, or some physical evidence will provide the answer. Or maybe the mystery will remain forever, a reminder that even in our age of documentation and investigation, some things remain unknown. The B-17 Ghost Bomber, the aircraft that landed itself, the crew that vanished, the creepiest mission of World War II. 80 years later, we're still asking the same questions the Belgian farmer asked when he first saw that bomber sitting in his field. Where did they go?
And the answer is the same today as it was then. We don't know. March 2nd, 1945, Oranienburg, Germany. Test pilot Erwin Ziller climbs into the cockpit of one of the most radical aircraft ever conceived. No fuselage, no tail, just a smooth black wing sweeping back at 32 degrees, powered by 2 Jumo 004 turbojet engines. The Horten Ho 229, Hitler's secret weapon. A jet-powered flying wing designed to strike London and return without being intercepted. An aircraft so advanced that modern engineers still marvel at its design 75 years later. Ziller advances the throttles, the jets spool up, the aircraft accelerates down the runway and lifts smoothly into the air. For 12 minutes, everything is perfect. The handling is responsive. The speed is phenomenal. This aircraft could change the war. Then one engine fails. The flying wing begins an uncontrollable roll. Ziller fights the controls. The aircraft plummets. It impacts the ground at high speed. Ziller dies on impact. The Ho 229 program dies with him. But the story of this aircraft, and the 2 brothers who designed it, is about far more than one fatal crash. It's about visionary engineering decades ahead of its time. It's about desperate innovation in a dying regime. It's about technology so advanced that when American forces captured the prototype, they kept it secret for decades. It's about a flying wing that shouldn't have been possible in 1945, but was. An aircraft that would influence jet design for generations. And 2 brothers who dreamed of flying wings while the Third Reich burned around them. This is the story of the Horten Ho 229, the jet fighter that was simultaneously Nazi Germany's last hope and a glimpse into the future of aviation. A machine born from brilliance and desperation in equal measure. Welcome to the race for the jet age, where innovation met ideology, where aerodynamics met desperation, and where 2 brothers created something that would haunt aviation history for decades. Before there was the Ho 229, there were 2 brothers obsessed with flying wings, Reimar and Walter Horten. Their story begins not with Nazi ideology or military ambition, but with pure aeronautical passion. Reimar Horten was born in 1915, Walter in 1913. They grew up in Bonn, Germany, during the chaotic years after World War I. Germany was economically devastated, politically unstable, and prohibited from building military aircraft under the Treaty of Versailles. But the treaty said nothing about gliders. The German youth glider movement of the 1920s and early 1930s was where the Horten brothers learned to fly. They weren't alone. Many future Luftwaffe pilots and aircraft designers started in gliders. But while others moved on to conventional powered aircraft, the Hortens became obsessed with a radical idea: the flying wing. Most aircraft have a conventional layout, a cylindrical fuselage holding the cockpit, payload and fuel, wings extending from the sides to generate lift, a tail section at the rear for stability and control. This configuration has worked since the Wright brothers. It's intuitive, it's stable, it's conventional, but it's also aerodynamically inefficient. The fuselage generates no lift, it's just dead weight and drag. The tail section exists only to stabilize the aircraft. More weight, more drag. From a pure efficiency standpoint, the conventional aircraft wastes energy, overcoming its own structural inefficiencies. A flying wing eliminates these problems. The entire aircraft is a wing. Everything, cockpit, engines, fuel, payload, is integrated into the wing structure. No fuselage, no tail, just a wing. The advantages are compelling. Reduced drag means higher speed or better fuel efficiency. Less structural weight means greater payload capacity. Smaller radar cross-section means better stealth characteristics, though in the 1920s, radar didn't exist yet. But flying wings have serious problems. Stability is a nightmare. Without a tail, the aircraft has no natural stabilizing surfaces. It's inherently unstable, requiring constant pilot input or advanced automatic control systems. Controlling pitch and yaw without conventional control surfaces is extraordinarily difficult, and designing a wing structure strong enough to contain everything while maintaining proper aerodynamic shape is a massive engineering challenge. Despite these problems, the Horten brothers believed flying wings represented the future of aviation. They were right, but they were also 40 years too early. In 1931, when Raymar was just 16 years old, the brothers designed and built their first flying wing glider, the Ho-Y. It was crude, fabric stretched over a wooden frame, basic flight controls, no sophistication. But it flew. More importantly, it flew well enough to convince the brothers they were onto something. Over the next decade, they would design and build a series of increasingly sophisticated flying wing gliders. The Ho-2, the Ho-3, the Ho-4. Each iteration solved more problems. Better aerodynamic shaping, more refined control systems, improved stability through careful center of gravity positioning and control surface design. By the late 1930s, the Horten brothers had become respected figures in German aviation circles. Their gliders won competitions. Their designs were discussed in aeronautical journals. But they remained hobbyists, building aircraft in their spare time with limited resources. Then came World War II, and everything changed. When war broke out in September 1939, both brothers were called up for military service. Walter became a fighter pilot, flying Messerschmitt Bf-109s in combat. Raymar, due to poor eyesight, was assigned to transport aircraft. But their reputation as innovative aircraft designers preceded them. The Luftwaffe was interested in unconventional designs. Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe, encouraged experimentation. If you had a radical idea that might provide an advantage, you could get resources to develop it. The Hortense flying wing concept qualified. In 1943, they were given permission to develop a powered flying wing fighter. Not as a primary project, the Luftwaffe had plenty of conventional fighters in development, but as an experimental program, a what-if project. What if you could build a high-performance fighter with dramatically reduced drag? The brothers designed the Ho-7, a powered flying wing with a single-piston engine. It flew in 1944 and demonstrated impressive performance. But by 1944, Germany's situation was desperate. The Luftwaffe was being decimated by Allied fighters and bombers. Fuel was scarce. Experienced pilots were dying faster than they could be replaced. Conventional piston engine fighters weren't enough anymore. Germany needed a technological leap. They needed jets. And this is where the story of the Ho-229 truly begins. Because in 1943, Hitler made a declaration that would drive German aircraft development for the rest of the war. A declaration that was simultaneously visionary and delusional. A declaration that would give the Horten brothers the opportunity to build their ultimate flying wing. Hitler called it the 1,000-1,000-1,000 requirement. He wanted a bomber that could carry 1,000 kilograms of bombs, fly 1,000 kilometers, and reach 1,000 kilometers per hour. 1,000 kilograms. 1,000 kilometers. 1,000 kilometers per hour. No aircraft in the world could meet those specifications in 1943. But the Horten brothers thought their flying wing design could. If they could mate their aerodynamically efficient flying wing concept with the new turbojet engines being developed, they might be able to build an aircraft that met Hitler's impossible requirements. They proposed the Ho-9, which would later be redesignated the Ho-229, a jet-powered flying wing fighter bomber. Fast enough to outrun Allied fighters, long-ranged enough to strike England and return, efficient enough to operate in Germany's fuel-starved logistics nightmare. The Luftwaffe was skeptical but desperate. They approved the project. The Horten brothers were given resources, materials, and priority. Build a prototype. Make it fly. proved the concept, and incredibly they did. The Horton-Ho 229 was not a conventional aircraft with some modifications. It was a fundamentally radical design that required solving problems no one had solved before. Let's start with the most obvious feature, the shape. The Ho 229 was a pure flying wing with no fuselage and no tail. The wingspan was 16.8 meters, about 55 feet. The wing swept back at 32 degrees. The entire aircraft, from the pilot's perspective, was just a wing extending in both directions. This wasn't just aesthetically radical, it was aerodynamically revolutionary for 1944. Swept wings provide advantages at high subsonic speeds by delaying the onset of compressibility effects, the aerodynamic problems that occur as you approach the speed of sound. But in 1944, swept wing theory was still developing. German aerodynamicist Adolf Busemann had presented swept wing research in 1935, but practical application was limited. The Horton brothers incorporated a 32-degree sweep, not primarily for high-speed performance, though that was a benefit, but to solve the stability and control problems inherent in flying wings. The sweep moved the center of lift relative to the center of gravity in ways that improved pitch stability. It was elegant engineering. The airfoil section varied across the span. Thicker at the center, where the cockpit and engines were located, thinner toward the wingtips. This wasn't unusual. Many aircraft use varying airfoil sections, but integrating everything into a wing structure while maintaining proper aerodynamic properties was extraordinarily difficult. The structure itself was remarkable. The frame was built from steel tubing welded together to form a rigid center section. Wooden ribs and spars extended outward to form the wing structure. The skin was a mixture of plywood panels bonded together. This mixed construction, steel, wood, plywood, was typical of late-war German aircraft. By 1944, aluminum was scarce. Priority went to aircraft already in production. Experimental designs used whatever materials were available, but this actually proved beneficial for the Ho 229. The wooden construction, combined with the smooth, organic shape, would later be discovered to have remarkable radar-absorbing properties. This wasn't intentional. The Hortens weren't trying to build a stealth aircraft. Radar was still primitive in 1944, and stealth technology as a concept didn't exist. But the combination of wood construction, iron oxide-based adhesives, and smooth contours accidentally created an aircraft with a significantly reduced radar cross-section. Decades later, when Northrop was developing the B-2 stealth bomber, itself a flying wing, engineers would study the Ho 229 and marvel at how the Horton brothers had inadvertently discovered stealth principles. But we're getting ahead of the story. In 1944, the Hortens were focused on making the aircraft fly, not making it invisible to radar. The control system was ingenious. Without a tail, the Ho 229 couldn't use conventional elevators for pitch control or a rudder for yaw control. Instead, the Hortens used elevons, control surfaces on the trailing edge of the wing that could move together or differentially. When both elevons moved up, the aircraft pitched up. When both moved down, it pitched down. When one moved up and the other down, the aircraft rolled. By combining roll and a slight amount of drag-induced yaw, the pilot could turn the aircraft without a rudder. This sounds simple in theory. In practice, it required extraordinarily precise aerodynamic calculations and careful mechanical design. The control surface sizes, positions, and deflection angles all had to be exactly right, or the aircraft would be unflyable. The Hortens got it right, or close enough. The power plant consisted of two junkers, Jumo 004 turbojet engines. These were the same engines used in the Messerschmitt Me 262, Germany's operational jet fighter. Each engine produced about 1,900 pounds of thrust, modest by modern standards, but revolutionary in 1944. The engines were mounted inside the wing, one on each side of the center cockpit section. The intakes were smooth, blended into the wing's leading edge. The exhausts exited at the trailing edge. Everything was integrated as cleanly as possible to minimize drag. But jet engines in 1944 were temperamental beasts. The Jumo 004 had an operational lifespan of about 25 hours, before it needed major maintenance or replacement. They were prone to flameouts, compressor stalls, and mechanical failures. They consumed fuel at an alarming rate, and they required careful handling. Advance the throttle too quickly, and you could damage the engine. For an already challenging flying wing design, adding unreliable early jet engines compounded the difficulties. But there was no alternative. Piston engines couldn't provide the speed and altitude performance required. Jets were the only option. The cockpit was surprisingly conventional, considering how radical the rest of the aircraft was. The pilot sat in a pressurized compartment in the center section, just forward of the wing's leading edge. Visibility was good. The smooth nose section provided unobstructed forward views. Instruments were standard Luftwaffe equipment. The control stick and rudder pedals operated conventional mechanical linkages to the control surfaces. The landing gear was tricycle configuration, nose wheel and two main wheels. This was somewhat unusual for German aircraft of the period, which typically used tailwheel configurations. But for a flying wing, tricycle gear made ground handling much easier and improved forward visibility during takeoff and landing. Armament for the production version was planned as 4 Mk, 103 30mm cannons mounted in the wing roots. With a rate of fire of 400 rounds per minute and devastating hitting power, 4 Mk-103s would make the Ho-229 a formidable fighter. The aircraft could also carry two 1,000-kilogram bombs internally for the bomber role, fitting Hitler's requirement exactly. The estimated performance specifications were impressive, even by modern standards. Maximum speed, over 900 kilometers per hour. Service ceiling, 15,000 meters. Range, over 1,000 kilometers. Rate of climb, superior to any Allied fighter. If these specifications could be achieved, the Ho-229 would be the most advanced combat aircraft in the world. But specifications on paper and actual performance are different things. The only way to know if the Ho-229 would work was to build it and fly it. Construction of the first prototype, designated Ho-9V1 because it was initially the 9th Horten design, later redesignated Ho-229, began in 1944 at a workshop in Göttingen. Resources were limited. The Horten brothers worked with a small team of technicians and craftsmen. Progress was slow but steady. By late 1944, the V1 prototype was complete. But there was a problem. They didn't have jet engines. The Jumo 004s were in high demand for the Me-262 program, and getting engines for an experimental flying wing was difficult. So the V1 flew as a glider first. In December 1944, towed aloft by a conventional aircraft, the unpowered Ho-229 V1 made a series of test flights, and it flew beautifully. The handling was responsive, the stability was acceptable, the control system worked, the basic aerodynamic concept was validated. The Hortens had proven the flying wing configuration could work. Now they needed to prove it could work with jet engines. The V2 prototype, the first jet-powered version, was completed in early 1945. This time, they had engines. Two Jumo 004s were installed, tested, and declared ready. The V2 would be the proof of concept. The aircraft that would demonstrate the Ho-229 could meet its performance goals. Test pilot Erwin Ziller was selected for the first flight. Ziller was experienced. He'd flown numerous experimental aircraft and was familiar with the challenges of new designs. If anyone could coax the Ho-229 into the air and back down safely, it was Ziller. February 2, 1945. Oranienburg Airfield, north of Berlin. The Ho-229. V2 sat on the runway, black against the winter landscape. Ziller conducted his pre-flight checks. The ground crew cleared the area. Ziller advanced the throttles. The jets spooled up with their characteristic whine. The aircraft began rolling. It accelerated rapidly. Jet acceleration was much more powerful than piston engines. At about 150 kilometers per hour, Ziller rotated and the Ho-229 lifted smoothly into the air. The first jet-powered flying wing was airborne. For the next hour, Ziller put the aircraft through initial tests. Basic handling checks, gentle turns, altitude changes, everything performed as expected. The Ho-229 was stable, responsive, and fast, very fast. Even at partial throttle, the aircraft was faster than most piston fighters at full power. Ziller landed successfully. The first flight was declared a complete success. The Horten brothers were ecstatic. The Luftwaffe observers were impressed. This radical design actually worked. Over the next month, Ziller made several more test flights. Each one pushed the envelope slightly further. Higher speeds, tighter turns, more aggressive maneuvers. The ww2 handled it all. Performance estimates were being validated. The aircraft was proving to be as good as the Hortens had promised. Then came March 2nd, 1945, the flight that would end the program. March 2nd, 1945, dawned cold and clear over Oranienburg. Perfect flying weather. Erwin Ziller arrived at the airfield for what was scheduled to be a routine test flight, the seventh flight of the V2 prototype. The flight plan was straightforward: take off, climb to altitude, conduct some handling tests, demonstrate the ww2 for some visiting Luftwaffe officials, then land. Expected duration, about 30 minutes. Nothing unusual, nothing risky. Ziller conducted his pre-flight walk-around. The ground crew had reported no mechanical issues. Both ww2 engines had been inspected and cleared for flight. Everything looked good. At approximately 10 a.m., Ziller climbed into the cockpit. He strapped in, conducted his cockpit checks, and signaled ready for engine start. The ground crew started the engines using external starter motors. The ww2s required external power to begin the starting sequence. The first engine started normally. The turbine spooled up, reached idle RPM, and stabilized. The second engine followed. Both engines showed normal temperatures and pressures. Ziller advanced the throttle slightly, checking engine response. Everything nominal. He released the brakes. The ww2 began rolling forward. The tricycle landing gear made ground handling easy, much easier than tailwheel aircraft that required careful rudder work to stay straight. Ziller taxied to the runway threshold. Air traffic control cleared him for takeoff. Ziller aligned with the runway centerline and smoothly advanced both throttles to takeoff power. The jets responded with their characteristic surge of thrust. The ww2 accelerated rapidly down the runway. At approximately 150 km per hour, Ziller eased back on the stick. The nose lifted. The main gear left the ground. The ww2 was airborne. Ziller retracted the landing gear. The gear doors closed smoothly, cleaning up the aircraft's aerodynamic profile. He continued the climb, maintaining runway heading initially, then banking into a gentle turn to the left. Everything was normal. The engines were running smoothly. The flight controls felt responsive. Airspeed was building nicely. This was going to be another successful test flight. For about 12 minutes it was. Ziller climbed to approximately 800 meters, about 2,600 feet. Not high by jet fighter standards, but adequate for the planned handling tests. He leveled off and began a series of turns, rolls, and other maneuvers to demonstrate the aircraft's capabilities to the observers on the ground. The ww2 performed beautifully. Rolls were crisp, turns were tight. The flying wing was proving to be not just flyable, but genuinely agile. One observer on the ground would later describe watching the black wing knife through the sky and thinking it looked like something from the future. He was right. But that future was about to be violently interrupted. At approximately 10:12 a.m., 12 minutes into the flight, one of the ww2 engines failed. Post-crash investigation would determine it was the right engine, though from the ground, observers couldn't tell which one had quit. They just saw the ww2 suddenly yaw sharply to one side. Engine failures in twin-engine aircraft are a known emergency, but they're manageable. Standard procedure: identify the failed engine, apply opposite rudder to counter the asymmetric thrust, reduce power on the good engine to reduce asymmetry, and set up for an emergency landing. Pilots practice this scenario repeatedly in training. But the ww2 didn't have a rudder. The asymmetric thrust from one working engine and one dead engine created a powerful yawing moment. In a conventional aircraft, the pilot would use the rudder to counter this. But the ww2's control system relied on elevons and drag-based yaw control. It wasn't designed for the extreme asymmetry of a complete engine failure. Ziller tried to compensate. He likely reduced power on the remaining good engine, standard procedure to reduce asymmetry. He probably applied opposite aileron to counter the roll induced by the yaw. But the aircraft was entering an uncontrollable situation. From the ground, observers watched the black flying wing begin to roll. The roll rate increased, the aircraft's nose dropped. Ziller was fighting for control, but the aerodynamic forces were overwhelming his inputs. The ww2 entered a spin, or something like a spin. Spinning a flying wing is aerodynamically complex and poorly understood even today. The aircraft rotated rapidly, nose down, losing altitude quickly. Ziller had options, theoretically. He could have attempted to restart the failed engine, though restart procedures in flight were unreliable with early jets. He could have tried to bail out, though the rotation rate might have made escape impossible. Or he could fight for control and attempt to recover. He chose to fight for control. For perhaps 30 seconds, Ziller struggled with the aircraft. Some witnesses reported seeing the rotation rate slow briefly. Perhaps he was making progress. But the ww2 was too low. There wasn't enough altitude to complete a recovery, even if one was possible. At approximately 10:13 a.m., the Horten Ho-229V2 impacted the ground at high speed approximately 2 kilometers from Oranienburg airfield. The impact was catastrophic. The wooden structure disintegrated on contact. Both Jumo 004 engines were torn from their mounts. The fuel tanks ruptured and ignited. Erwin Ziller died instantly. He was 34 years old. Emergency crews rushed to the crash site, but there was nothing they could do. The Ho-229V2 was completely destroyed. Only fragments remained. The wreckage burned for hours. The cause was clear: asymmetric engine failure and inability to control the aircraft with only one engine operating. But the question was this a fundamental design flaw, or could it be fixed? The investigation that followed examined every aspect of the flight and crash. The engine that failed was removed from the wreckage and analyzed. The failure was traced to a fuel system problem, not unique to the Ho-229 installation, but a known issue with early Jumo 004 engines. The engine hadn't failed because of anything the Hortens had done wrong. It had failed because early jet engines were unreliable. But the inability to control the aircraft after the engine failure was a design issue. The Ho-229's control system, optimized for symmetric flight, couldn't handle the extreme asymmetry of one engine out. Some engineers argued this could be fixed with control system refinements and better training. Others argued it was an inherent limitation of the flying wing configuration. We'll never know which assessment was correct because the program died with Ziller. Hermann Göring ordered the Ho-229 program to continue. A third prototype, the V3, was already under construction and nearly complete. But by March 1945, Germany was collapsing. Resources were non-existent. Oranienburg airfield was under threat from advancing Soviet forces. The priority was keeping operational fighters in the air, not developing experimental aircraft. The V3 prototype was evacuated from Oranienburg and moved to a secret workshop in Thuringia. Work continued, but progress was slow. There were no engines available, materials were scarce. The technicians were being pulled away for more urgent tasks. By April 1945, work on the Ho-229 had effectively stopped. The dream of the jet-powered flying wing was over. Or so it seemed. April 14, 1945. American forces from the U.S. Third Army's 8th Corps advanced into Thuringia, deep in central Germany. The speed of the American advance surprised even the Americans themselves. German resistance was collapsing faster than anticipated. Intelligence officers accompanied the combat units tasked with locating German research facilities, weapons programs, and advanced technology. The Allies knew Germany had been developing jet aircraft, rockets, and other advanced weapons. Capturing these technologies and the scientists who created them was a high priority. Near the town of Friedrichroda, American troops discovered a concealed workshop in a forest. Inside, they found something extraordinary. An almost complete aircraft unlike anything Allied intelligence had seen before. No fuselage, no tail, just a smooth, swept wing with two large openings where engines would be mounted. The Ho-229V3 prototype. Also discovered were design documents, technical drawings, performance calculations, and photographs of the previous prototypes. The intelligence officers immediately recognized the significance. This wasn't just another German experimental aircraft. This was something fundamentally different, something that represented a potential leap in aviation technology. The V3 prototype was carefully disassembled and crated. The documents were collected and catalogued. Everything was shipped to the United States under tight security. The Ho-229 was classified secret and its existence was not publicly disclosed. Why the secrecy? Several reasons. First, the Americans didn't want the Soviets to know about the Ho-229. The alliance was already fracturing. Within months, it would become the Cold War. Any technology that might give an advantage was carefully guarded. The flying wing concept was too valuable to share. Second, American aircraft manufacturers were interested in the Ho-229's design. Northrop Aircraft had been working on flying wing designs since the 1930s. Jack Northrop, the company's founder, was obsessed with flying wings for the same reasons the Horten brothers were: aerodynamic efficiency. But Northrop's designs had been conventional-powered aircraft. A jet-powered flying wing was still theoretical. The Ho-229 proved it was possible, and American manufacturers wanted time to study the design, understand its innovations, and potentially incorporate them into American aircraft without foreign competition, knowing what they'd learned. Third, there were concerns about public perception. Germany had been developing advanced technologies throughout the war: jet aircraft, ballistic missiles, advanced submarines. The Ho-229 was another example. If the public learned that Nazi Germany had been this close to deploying a jet fighter more advanced than anything the Allies had, there would be uncomfortable questions about Allied technology development and intelligence failures. So the Ho-229 disappeared into the classified world. The V3 prototype was initially sent to Wright Field in Ohio, where the Air Technical Intelligence Center was located. German aviation experts, including some who had worked on various Luftwaffe programs, were brought to the United States under Operation Paperclip. They were interrogated about German aviation technology, including the Ho-229, but the Horten brothers weren't among them. Reimar Horten was captured by Allied forces but was considered too junior to be of interest for Paperclip. Walter Horten had survived the war and remained in Germany. The brothers were briefly separated during the chaos of post-war Germany. Without the designers available for consultation, American engineers had to reverse engineer the Ho-229 from the physical prototype and the captured documents. This proved challenging. Some of the design decisions the Hortens had made weren't obvious from examination alone. The aerodynamic calculations were complex. The structural load paths weren't immediately apparent. Wind tunnel testing was conducted. The V3's airframe was studied in detail. Performance predictions were made based on the captured data and American understanding of jet engine performance. The conclusions were sobering. If the Ho-229 had been deployed operationally with reliable engines, it would have been extremely difficult for Allied fighters to intercept. Its top speed would have exceeded 600 miles per hour, faster than any Allied piston fighter and comparable to early Allied jets that weren't yet operational. Its range would have allowed strikes deep into Allied territory. Its small radar cross-section would have made it difficult to detect with the primitive radar systems of 1945. But the key phrase is, if it had been deployed. The Ho-229 was a prototype. Only 2 had flown, and 1 had crashed fatally. The third was never completed. There was no production infrastructure. There were no trained pilots beyond the test pilots. There were no operational doctrines for how to employ flying wing fighters. The Ho-229 was a technological achievement, but it wasn't a war winner. Germany's defeat was driven by strategic factors: overwhelming Allied industrial capacity, manpower advantages, logistical superiority, and the Soviet steamroller from the east. A handful of advanced fighters, however impressive, couldn't change those realities. Still, the technology was valuable. American engineers incorporated lessons from the Ho-229 into subsequent flying wing research. Jack Northrop's company continued developing flying wings through the late 1940s and early 1950s. The YB-49, an experimental flying wing bomber, flew in 1947. It was larger than the ww2 and powered by 8 jet engines. But the basic configuration was similar: swept wing, no tail, jet propulsion. The YB-49 program was eventually cancelled due to stability and control issues, many of the same problems the Hortens had grappled with. But the research continued. Northrop remained convinced that flying wings represented the future of aviation. Decades later, that conviction would be validated. The B-2 Spirit stealth bomber, which entered service in 1997, is a direct descendant of the flying wing concept pioneered by the Horten brothers and Jack Northrop. The B-2's designers studied the HO-229 extensively. Some of the aerodynamic solutions the Hortens discovered in the 1940s were incorporated into the B-2's design. In 1950, the HO-229 V3 prototype was moved to the Smithsonian Institution's storage facility. It remained there, largely forgotten, for decades. Occasional researchers would request access to study it, but public knowledge of the aircraft was limited. It wasn't until the 1980s, when Cold War secrecy began to thaw and historical interest in World War II, advanced weapons increased, that the HO-229's story began to emerge publicly. Aviation historians discovered references to the Horten flying wing in captured German documents. Former Luftwaffe personnel began talking about the experimental programs they'd worked on. The Horten brothers, Reimar and Walter, were interviewed by aviation historians in the 1980s and 1990s. They'd remained in contact after the war and had continued discussing flying wing designs, though neither had the resources to build aircraft anymore. They were surprised and pleased to learn that their wartime work was being recognized and studied. Reimar Horten, in particular, was articulate about the technical challenges they'd faced and the solutions they'd devised. He explained the aerodynamic principles behind the swept wing configuration. He detailed the control system design. He discussed the materials choices and construction techniques. What emerged from these interviews was a portrait of two engineers driven by pure aeronautical passion who happened to be working for a monstrous regime. The Hortens weren't motivated by Nazi ideology. They were motivated by the challenge of making flying wings work. The war gave them resources and opportunity they wouldn't have had otherwise, but their ultimate goal was aeronautical excellence, not military victory. This presents a moral complexity that historians still grapple with. Can you separate the technology from the regime that produced it? Can you admire the engineering achievement while condemning the purposes it was intended to serve? There's no easy answer. But the HO-229 story is incomplete without acknowledging this tension. In 2008, the Smithsonian Institution and the Northrop Grumman Corporation launched an extraordinary project. Rebuild the Horten HO-229 using authentic materials and techniques, then test it to determine if it had stealth characteristics. This wasn't just historical curiosity. This was serious aerospace engineering research with implications for modern stealth technology. Because by the 2000s, aviation historians and engineers had begun asking a provocative question. Did the Horten brothers accidentally invent stealth technology in 1944? The question arose from analyzing the HO-229's construction and shape. Several characteristics suggested it might have a reduced radar cross-section. First, the flying wing configuration inherently presents a smaller profile to radar. There's no tail section reflecting radar waves back to the transmitter. There's no cylindrical fuselage creating strong radar returns. The smooth, continuous curves of the wing scatter radar energy in multiple directions, rather than reflecting it directly back. Second, the HO-229's 32-degree wing sweep angles surfaces away from perpendicular to incoming radar waves. Radar reflection is strongest when surfaces are perpendicular to the radar beam. Angled surfaces reflect energy away from the source. Third, the construction materials were unusual. The plywood skin bonded with sawdust, mixed with charcoal and special adhesives, containing significant amounts of iron oxide. These materials, it turned out, have radar-absorbing properties. They're not as effective as modern radar-absorbing materials, but they do reduce radar returns. Fourth, the engine intakes and exhausts were smoothly integrated into the wing, minimizing cavities that could create strong radar reflections. None of this was intentional. The Hortense chose the flying wing configuration for aerodynamic efficiency. They chose the wing sweep for stability and control. They used wood and plywood because aluminum was scarce. The iron oxide adhesives were chosen for their bonding properties, not radar absorption. But the cumulative effect of all these design choices was an aircraft with a significantly smaller radar signature than conventional aircraft of the same era. The 2008 project aimed to quantify this. Could the Ho-229 have evaded 1940s-era radar? The Northrop Grumman team, working with Smithsonian conservators, carefully measured and documented the surviving V-3 prototype. They created detailed CAD models of the entire aircraft. They analyzed the materials, measuring their electrical properties to determine how they would interact with radar waves. Then they built a full-scale replica of the center section using authentic materials: wood, plywood, steel tubing, and period-correct adhesives. This wasn't a flying replica. They weren't trying to recreate the flight characteristics. They were recreating the radar characteristics. The replica was taken to a radar testing range and subjected to radar illumination at frequencies typical of 1940s British chain-home radar systems, the primary air defense radar used by the Allies. The results were startling. The Ho-229 replica showed a radar cross-section approximately 40% smaller than a conventional fighter of similar size. More significantly, the testing revealed that British radar operators in 1945 would have detected the Ho-229 at about 80% of the range they would detect a conventional German fighter. Let's put that in concrete terms. If chain-home radar could detect a Messerschmitt Bf 109 at 100 miles, it would detect a Ho-229 at about 80 miles. That's a 20-mile advantage, several minutes of warning time lost. In air defense terms, that's significant. More importantly, the reduced detection range combined with the Ho-229's high speed would have created serious problems for Allied air defense. By the time radar detected an incoming Ho-229, it would be much closer to its target than conventional radars. Scrambling interceptors and vectoring them to intercept would have been much more difficult. The testing also revealed something the engineers hadn't expected. The Ho-229's radar signature varied significantly depending on the angle of observation. From certain angles, particularly nose-on and at shallow angles from below, the radar return was extremely small, approaching what modern engineers would call low observable. This wasn't true stealth. The aircraft wasn't invisible to radar, but it was significantly harder to detect and track than conventional aircraft. And this was achieved accidentally through design choices made for entirely different reasons. The implications were profound. The Horten brothers, working with 1940s technology and limited resources, had stumbled onto stealth principles that wouldn't be formally developed for another 30 years. They'd created an aircraft that was decades ahead of its time, not just in aerodynamics, but in low observable technology. Could this have changed the war? Almost certainly not. By the time the Ho-229 flew its first test flight, Germany had only 2 months left. Even if the program had continued and production aircraft had been built, there wouldn't have been time to produce enough to matter. Germany's defeat was inevitable by early 1945. But if the Ho-229 had been developed earlier, if it had been operational in 1943 or even 1944, that's a more interesting counterfactual. An operational Ho-229 fleet in 1943 could have seriously complicated Allied strategic bombing campaigns over Germany. The reduced radar detection range would have made it harder to provide early warning of interceptors. The high speed would have made it difficult for bomber escort fighters to engage effectively. The heavy armament would have been devastating against bomber formations. But this requires assuming several things that weren't true. It assumes the Jumo 004 jet engines would have been reliable enough for operational use. They weren't. It assumes Germany would have had the manufacturing capacity to produce Ho-229s in significant numbers while also producing Me-262s, conventional fighters, and other weapons. They didn't. It assumes enough trained pilots would have been available. They weren't. The Ho-229 was a technological marvel, but technology alone doesn't win wars. Germany lost World War II because of strategic factors far beyond any single weapon system's capabilities. Still, the stealth revelation changed how aviation historians viewed the Ho-229. It wasn't just an interesting experimental aircraft, it was a genuine glimpse into the future of aviation, a future that would take decades to arrive. The B-2 Spirit stealth bomber, which entered service in 1997, bears a striking resemblance to the Ho-229. Both are flying wings. Both use smooth, continuous curves to minimize radar returns. Both integrate engines into the wing structure. Both use composite materials with radar-absorbing properties. The B-2's designers studied the Ho-229 extensively during the development process. While the B-2 is far more sophisticated, it uses active radar-absorbing materials, computer-controlled fly-by-wire systems, and aerodynamic refinements the Hortens never dreamed of. The basic configuration principles are remarkably similar. Jack Northrop, who spent decades advocating for flying wing aircraft, died in 1981. Shortly before his death, he was shown classified footage of the B-2 development aircraft. Northrop, who was wheelchair-bound and could no longer speak due to a stroke, reportedly wrote on a notepad, "Now I know why God has kept me alive for the last 25 years. He'd lived to see his flying wing vision vindicated, and implicit in that vindication was the validation of the Horten brothers' work 40 years earlier. The Ho-229's story is incomplete without understanding that the Horten brothers weren't the only engineers pursuing flying wing technology during World War II. There were parallel developments in other countries, though none reached the same advanced stage as the Ho-229. In the United States, Jack Northrop's company had been building flying wing aircraft since the 1930s. The N-1M, which first flew in 1940, was a small experimental flying wing powered by piston engines. It was strictly a research aircraft, too small and underpowered for military use, but it validated the basic aerodynamic principles. During the war, Northrop proposed a flying wing fighter to the U.S. Army Air Forces. The design was similar in concept to what the Hortens were working on, a jet-powered flying wing with heavy armament and high performance. But the proposal was rejected. American military planners were conservative. They wanted proven conventional designs, not experimental configurations. Northrop persisted. By 1944, he'd secured a contract to develop the XB-35, a massive flying wing bomber powered by piston engines. The XB-35 had a wingspan of 172 feet, more than 3 times the Ho-229's wingspan. It was designed to carry 10,000 pounds of bombs across intercontinental ranges. The first XB-35 didn't fly until after the war ended, in June 1946, and it immediately demonstrated the problems inherent in large flying wings. Stability and control issues were severe, and the contra-rotating propellers caused intense vibrations that threatened to shake the aircraft apart. The XB-35 program led to the YB-49, a jet-powered version that replaced the propellers with 8 jet engines. The YB-49 first flew in October 1947. It was impressively fast, cruising at over 400 miles per hour, but stability problems persisted. The aircraft was challenging to fly, and landing was particularly difficult. More problematically, the flying wing configuration made it nearly impossible to aim bombs accurately. Without a conventional fuselage, there was no natural reference line for the bombardier. The YB-49's bombing accuracy was significantly worse than conventional bombers. This, combined with the ongoing stability issues, led to the program's cancellation in 1949. Jack Northrop believed the cancellation was political, that the Air Force wanted to buy the Convair B-36 bomber instead and used the YB-49's problems as justification. There's some evidence supporting this theory, but it's also true that the YB-49 had genuine technical problems that wouldn't be solved for decades. The point is this: even with significant resources, a dedicated design team, and access to advanced technology, American engineers in the late 1940s couldn't make large flying wings work reliably. Yet the Horten brothers, working with limited resources in a collapsing regime, had created a smaller flying wing that actually flew successfully, at least until the engine failure. This speaks to the Hortense engineering talent. They'd solved problems through clever design and careful aerodynamic analysis that American engineers with more resources struggled to solve. In Britain, there was also flying wing research during the war. The Armstrong-Whitworth ww2, a jet-powered flying wing research aircraft, was designed in 1943 but didn't fly until 1947. Like the American designs, it encountered severe stability problems. The program was eventually abandoned. The Soviets captured some German flying wing research at the war's end, including documents and possibly some hardware from early Horten designs. They experimented with flying wing concepts in the late 1940s and early 1950s, but like the Western Allies, they couldn't solve the stability and control problems satisfactorily. Soviet flying wing projects were cancelled in favor of conventional configurations. So why were the Hortens more successful? Several factors. First, they focused on a smaller aircraft. The ww2 had a wingspan of 16 meters. American and British flying wing projects were much larger. The XB-35's wingspan was over 50 meters. Stability and control problems scale with size. A smaller flying wing is inherently easier to stabilize than a larger one. Second, the Hortens had been working on flying wing designs since the early 1930s. They had 15 years of experience with gliders and powered flying wings before they attempted the ww2. They understood the aerodynamic problems intimately and had developed solutions through iterative design. Third, they made clever design choices. The 32-degree wing sweep, the specific airfoil sections, the eleven control system. These weren't guesses. They were carefully calculated solutions to known problems. Fourth, they had realistic performance goals. The ww2 was designed to meet Hitler's 1,000 requirement, but that was for a fighter bomber role. They weren't trying to build a heavy bomber like the XB-35. The smaller size and lighter weight made the engineering challenges more manageable. But all of this raises an interesting question. If the Hortens were so successful, why didn't flying wings become the standard configuration for jet aircraft? The answer is that the problems the Hortens solved for a small fighter bomber don't scale to other roles. Large flying wings, as American research demonstrated, have severe stability and control issues. Modern fly-by-wire computer systems can compensate for these issues, but such systems didn't exist in the 1940s or 1950s. Additionally, conventional aircraft configurations work well enough for most purposes. The efficiency gains of flying wings are real, but not overwhelming for many roles. A conventional fighter or bomber might have 10% more drag than an equivalent flying wing, but that's acceptable if the conventional design is easier to build, maintain, and fly. Flying wings make sense for specific roles where efficiency is paramount. Long-range strategic bombers benefit enormously from the reduced drag, hence the B-2 spirit. Unmanned aircraft, where the pilot doesn't need visibility from a conventional cockpit, can use flying wing configurations effectively, hence modern stealth drones. But for general aviation purposes, the conventional configuration remains dominant simply because it works well enough and is easier to implement. The ww2 was ahead of its time precisely because it was designed for a role, fast jet fighter bomber, where the flying wing configuration's advantages outweighed its disadvantages. And it was developed by engineers who understood the configuration deeply enough to make it work. After the war, the Horten brothers' lives took different paths, though they remained in contact and continued discussing flying wing designs. Reimar Horten, the younger brother and the primary aerodynamicist, was captured by Allied forces in May 1945. He was interrogated about the ww2 and other Horten flying wing projects. The interrogators were impressed by his technical knowledge, but determined he wasn't a candidate for Operation Paperclip. He was released and returned to civilian life in Germany. Post-war Germany was devastated, employment was scarce, aviation work was prohibited under Allied occupation rules. Germany wasn't allowed to build aircraft of any kind. Reimar worked various jobs to survive, but his passion remained flying wings. In 1948, he emigrated to Argentina. The Argentine government, under President Juan Perón, was actively recruiting German scientists and engineers. Argentina wanted to develop an indigenous aviation industry, and German expertise was welcomed. No questions asked about wartime activities. Reimar Horten found work with the Instituto Aerotecnico in Córdoba, Argentina. Finally, he could work on aircraft again. And naturally, he proposed flying wings. Between 1948 and the early 1960s, Reimar designed and helped build several flying wing aircraft in Argentina. The IAE-34 Clen Antu was a flying wing glider completed in 1948. The IAE-37 was a jet-powered flying wing research aircraft that flew in the early 1950s. The IAE-38, a jet-powered fighter-bomber project based heavily on the ww2 concept, was designed but never completed. None of these projects achieved the success of the ww2. The Argentine aviation industry lacked the resources and technical sophistication to fully support advanced aircraft development. But Reimar persisted, refining his flying wing concepts and training Argentine engineers in flying wing aerodynamics. He remained in Argentina for the rest of his life. In interviews conducted in the 1980s and 1990s, Reimar spoke extensively about the ww2 and flying wing theory. He was generous with his knowledge, answering technical questions in detail and providing insights into the design decisions he and Walter had made. Reimar Horten died in 1994 at the age of 79. He never saw the B-2 bomber become operational. It was still in development when he died. But he knew about the program and understood that his flying wing work had contributed to modern stealth aircraft development. Walter Horten, the older brother and a combat pilot during the war, remained in Germany after the war. He'd survived numerous combat missions, flying Bf-19s and other fighters. After the war, he couldn't fly. Allied occupation authorities prohibited Germans from flying aircraft, but he worked in various engineering roles. When restrictions on German aviation were lifted in the 1950s, Walter returned to aviation, though not in flying wing design. He worked for several German aerospace companies in conventional aircraft roles, but he maintained his interest in flying wings and stayed in touch with Reimar in Argentina. Walter provided technical information to aviation historians researching the ww2. His interviews, combined with Reimar's, provided crucial insights into the development of the ww2 and earlier Horten flying wings. Without their cooperation, much of the technical detail would have been lost. Walter Horten died in 1998 at the age of 84. By then, the ww2 had been recognized as a significant milestone in aviation history, and the Horten brothers' contributions were being studied seriously by aerospace engineers worldwide. The brothers never expressed regret about working for Nazi Germany, which has troubled some historians. When asked about the moral implications of developing weapons for the Third Reich, their responses were typically technical rather than moral. They'd been engineers focused on solving aeronautical problems. They hadn't been involved in atrocities or war crimes. They'd built aircraft because that's what they knew how to do. This perspective is understandable but incomplete. They benefited from a system that was committing genocide. Their work supported that system's military efforts. Moral responsibility isn't negated by technical focus. Yet it's also true that their work transcended the regime they served. The flying wing concepts they developed continue to influence aviation. The ww2 proved that jet-powered flying wings were practical, paving the way for modern stealth aircraft. Aerospace engineers today study Horten aerodynamics to understand flying wing stability and control. In some ways, the Horten brothers' legacy is similar to Werner von Braun's. Von Braun developed the V-2 ballistic missile for Nazi Germany, a weapon that killed thousands of civilians and was built using slave labor. After the war, he worked for the United States and developed the rockets that put Americans on the moon. His legacy is complicated. Visionary rocket scientist or Nazi collaborator. The Horten brothers didn't achieve von Braun's post-war prominence, but the moral questions are similar. Do we celebrate the technology while acknowledging the context? Do we study the engineering while condemning the regime? There's no simple answer. What's clear is that the ww2 was a genuine engineering achievement. It pushed the boundaries of what was possible with 1940s technology. It proved concepts that wouldn't be fully validated for decades. and it influenced aviation development in ways the brothers couldn't have imagined. In 2009, the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum began a comprehensive restoration project on the ww2 V3 prototype. The aircraft had been in storage since 1950, carefully preserved but not displayed. The restoration would prepare it for eventual public display while also providing opportunities for detailed technical analysis. The restoration team faced unique challenges. The ww2 was built using mixed materials, steel tubing, wood, plywood, that aged differently. Some wooden components had deteriorated significantly over 60 years. The plywood skin had separated in places. Metal parts showed corrosion, but the restoration philosophy was conservative. Preserve original materials wherever possible, stabilize the structure to prevent further deterioration, but don't rebuild or replace components unless absolutely necessary. This aircraft was a historical artifact, not a flying restoration. The goal was to preserve it as it was captured in 1945. As conservators carefully disassembled and examined components, remarkable details emerged. The craftsmanship was extraordinary. Despite being built in a workshop with limited resources in late 1944, the construction quality was high. Joints were carefully fitted, welds were clean. The plywood skin was precisely shaped. The steel tubing framework showed evidence of careful engineering. Load paths were efficiently designed. Structural members were sized appropriately for the stresses they would encounter. This wasn't crude wartime expedient construction. This was thoughtful engineering executed competently. The wing's internal structure revealed how the Hortense solved the challenge of integrating everything into a wing shape. The center section contained spaces for the cockpit, the two engines, fuel tanks, and landing gear, all arranged to maintain proper center of gravity and structural integrity. It was like a three-dimensional puzzle, with each component positioned carefully to make everything fit while maintaining aerodynamic shape. The elevon control system showed clever mechanical design. The linkages that connected the control stick to the elevons were arranged to provide proper control surface movements, while accounting for the wing's sweep and the elevon's positions. Without computer-aided design, the Hortense had worked this out, using manual calculations and careful mechanical design. Modern aerospace engineers who examined the ww2 during restoration were impressed. One engineer from Northrop Grumman commented that the Hortense had solved control system problems that American engineers struggled with 15 years later when developing the YB-49. The solutions were elegant and practical. The adhesive used to bond plywood panels proved particularly interesting. Analysis showed it contained significant amounts of charcoal and iron oxide. This wasn't standard aircraft adhesive. Post-war research determined this specific formulation had radar-absorbing properties, the basis for the stealth testing discussed earlier. But here's the question that has never been definitively answered. Did the Hortense intentionally choose this adhesive for its radar-absorbing properties, or was it simply what was available? Reimar Horten, in interviews before his death, gave conflicting answers. Sometimes he suggested they'd considered radar absorption. Other times, he indicated the adhesive choice was based on availability and bonding strength. The truth may be somewhere in between. They may have been aware of radar-absorbing properties but considered it a secondary benefit, not a primary design goal. The engines, or rather the engine mounts, since no engines were installed in the V3, showed how the Hortense planned to integrate the JUMO 004s. The mounting system allowed relatively easy engine removal and installation, important for maintenance since early jet engines required frequent servicing. The intake and exhaust ducting was smoothly contoured to minimize aerodynamic losses. One detail that surprised modern engineers was the simplicity. The ww2 didn't use complex systems or exotic materials. It was fundamentally conventional engineering applied cleverly to an unconventional configuration. This suggested that flying wings weren't as difficult as post-war development suggested, or that the Hortense were exceptionally talented engineers who made it look easier than it was. The restoration also revealed evidence of the rushed nature of late-war German production. Some components showed improvisation. Standard fasteners were used where custom fittings would have been better. Some structural members were sized larger than necessary, suggesting conservative engineering when precise calculations weren't possible. Yet despite these wartime compromises, the overall design was sound. If the V3 had been completed and flown, experts believe it would have performed similarly to the V2, fast, maneuverable, and effective. By 2011, the restoration had progressed to the point where the Ho-229 could be displayed. The Smithsonian's Udvar Hazy Center, an extension of the Air and Space Museum located near Dulles Airport in Virginia, prepared a special exhibit. The Ho-229 V3 was positioned prominently, suspended from the ceiling as if in flight. Interpretive panels explained the aircraft's history, technical innovations, and significance. Visitors could see the smooth flying wing shape, the swept wings, the engine openings, and imagine what this aircraft might have meant if it had been deployed operationally. The exhibit also addressed the moral complexity. It acknowledged that the Ho-229 was developed by Nazi Germany, a regime responsible for genocide and aggressive war. It noted that the aircraft's purpose was to strike Allied targets and kill Allied personnel. But it also explained the technical innovations and the aircraft's influence on post-war aviation development. This balanced approach, acknowledging both the historical context and the technical achievement, is essential. We can't sanitize history or pretend that brilliant engineering wasn't created in service of terrible causes. But we also can't ignore the engineering simply because of its origins. The Ho-229 represents both human ingenuity and human destructiveness. It's a reminder that technology is neutral. How it's used determines whether it's beneficial or harmful. The Ho-229's influence on post-war aviation development is difficult to quantify precisely, but it's clearly significant. Most obviously, the Ho-229 influenced American flying wing research. When Jack Northrop's engineers were developing the YB-49 in the late 1940s, they had access to captured Ho-229 documents and could examine the V3 prototype. While the YB-49 was a much larger aircraft with different design parameters, some of the control system solutions the Hortens developed informed American approaches. More broadly, the Ho-229 demonstrated that jet-powered flying wings were practical. Before the Ho-229 flew, flying wings were theoretical or had only flown with piston engines. The Ho-229 proved the concept could work with jets, validating the configuration for high-performance applications. This validation was important for maintaining interest in flying wing research during the decades when stability and control problems seemed insurmountable. Engineers could point to the Ho-229 and say, "They made it work with 1940s technology. We can make it work with modern systems." The stealth revelation in 2008 added another dimension to the Ho-229's legacy. Modern stealth aircraft designers study the Ho-229 to understand early radar cross-section reduction principles. While modern stealth uses far more sophisticated techniques, the basic concepts, smooth contours, angular surfaces deflecting radar, radar-absorbing materials, are all present in the Ho-229, even if accidentally. The B-2 Spirit bomber is the most visible example of Ho-229 influence. The resemblance is striking. Both are flying wings with swept leading edges, both integrate engines into the wing, both use smooth contours throughout. The B-2's designers explicitly studied the Ho-229 during development. But the influence extends beyond just the B-2. Modern unmanned combat air vehicles, many of which use flying wing configurations, owe a debt to the Ho-229. The X-47B, an experimental carrier-based UCAV, is a flying wing. The BAE Taranis, a British stealth drone demonstrator, is a flying wing. The Russian Okhotnik UCAV is a flying wing. These modern aircraft use fly-by-wire computer control systems to solve the stability problems that plagued early flying wings. But the basic aerodynamic configuration traces directly back to pioneers like the Horten brothers and Jack Northrop. In academic aerospace engineering, the Ho-229 is studied as a case study in flying wing design. University courses on aircraft design often include analysis of the Ho-229's aerodynamics. Research papers have been published analyzing its stability characteristics, control system design, and structural engineering. The aircraft has also entered popular culture. The Ho-229 appears in documentaries about secret Nazi weapons. It features in video games about World War II aviation. It's mentioned in alternative history novels exploring what might have happened if Germany had deployed advanced weapons earlier. Some of this popular culture treatment borders on sensationalism, the Nazi superweapon narrative that exaggerates the Ho-229's potential impact. But it's also kept the aircraft in public consciousness and sparked interest in aviation history. Model aircraft companies produce Ho-229 kits. RC aircraft enthusiasts build flying-scale models. Some of these models are quite sophisticated, using modern materials and control systems to make the flying wing configuration work. These hobby projects, in a small way, continue the work the Horton brothers began. Educational programs use the Ho-229 to teach principles of aerodynamics and engineering design. The aircraft presents interesting problems. How do you control an aircraft without a tail? How do you integrate engines into a wing? How do you balance competing requirements for stability, control, and performance? These aren't just historical questions, they're relevant to modern aircraft design, especially for unconventional configurations. The Ho-229 also serves as a cautionary tale about technology and ethics. It's a reminder that brilliant engineering can be created for terrible purposes. The aircraft's beauty, and it is aesthetically striking, doesn't erase the fact that it was designed to deliver bombs to civilian targets. This tension between technological achievement and moral context is important. We should study the Ho-229's engineering. We should appreciate the innovations. But we should also remember why it was built and what it was intended to do. In the broader history of aviation, the Ho-229 occupies a unique place. It's not as famous as the Wright Flyer or the Spirit of St. Louis. It's not as historically significant as the Supermarine Spitfire or the Boeing B-17. It never achieved operational status, never flew combat missions, never changed the course of the war. But it represents a moment when the future of aviation was visible, even if the technology to fully realize that future didn't yet exist. It showed what was possible. Even if it would take decades to make it practical, the Ho-229 is a bridge between the propeller era and the jet age, between conventional aircraft and stealth technology, between World War II desperation and Cold War innovation. It's a glimpse of the future, frozen in 1945, waiting for the rest of aviation to catch up. Any discussion of advanced World War II German weapons inevitably leads to alternative history speculation. What if the Ho-229 had been operational earlier? What if the engine reliability problems had been solved? What if Germany had deployed hundreds of Ho-229s instead of just building prototypes? These questions are popular in alternative history forums and speculative documentaries. But answering them requires understanding the realities of Germany's strategic situation and the limitations of the Ho-229 as a weapon system. Let's start with a realistic scenario. Suppose the Ho-229 program had been prioritized in 1943 instead of 1944. Suppose Reimar and Walter Horten had been given substantial resources, skilled personnel, and production priority. Suppose the design had been refined, tested thoroughly, and put into production by mid-1944. What then? First, consider the numbers. Germany's aircraft production in 1944 was approximately 40,000 aircraft total, including all types: fighters, bombers, transports, trainers. Of these, about 25,000 were fighters. The Messerschmitt Me 262 jet fighter, which was prioritized and did enter production, had about 1,400 examples built before the war ended. Even with priority, the Ho-229 might have achieved similar production numbers, perhaps 1,000 to 2,000 aircraft. This assumes solving the engine reliability problems, establishing production infrastructure, training production workers, and maintaining supply chains while Germany was being bombed relentlessly. 1,000 Ho-229s sounds significant. But consider, the Luftwaffe was facing combined Allied air forces with tens of thousands of aircraft. The USAAF alone had over 13,000 combat aircraft in Europe by 1944. The RAF had thousands more. The Soviets had massive air forces on the Eastern Front. Even if every Ho-229 achieved a favorable kill ratio against Allied aircraft, say 5-1, the mathematics don't favor Germany. 1,000 Ho-229s destroy 5,000 Allied aircraft. The Allies replace them and keep coming. Germany doesn't have the industrial capacity, fuel, or trained pilots to sustain operations. But let's consider tactical effects. The Ho-229's high speed and reduced radar signature would have complicated Allied bomber operations over Germany. Bomber formations relied on early warning, from radar to scramble fighter escorts. If German interceptors could approach undetected or be detected at reduced range, they'd have tactical advantages. Heavy bomber formations, like the American B-17 and B-24s, were vulnerable to fighter attack, especially before long-range escort fighters became available. A fast, heavily armed fighter like the Ho-229 could have inflicted serious casualties. However, by late 1943 and early 1944, the Allies had developed tactics to deal with fast German interceptors. Fighter escorts increased. Bomber defensive formations were refined. Bombing missions were coordinated with fighter sweeps to suppress German defenses. The Ho-229 would have been another threat to adapt to, but probably not a game-changer. The Allies adapted to the Me-262, which was arguably a more significant threat since it was actually deployed in numbers. They would have adapted to the Ho-229. On the bombing role, Hitler's original vision of using it to strike Britain, the Ho-229 would have faced different challenges. The aircraft's range was about 1,000 kilometers, which meant it could reach London from bases in occupied France or the Low Countries. Its speed would make interception difficult. Its bomb load was modest, but sufficient for tactical strikes. But by 1944, the Allies controlled the air over their own territory. British air defenses were sophisticated. Radar coverage was comprehensive. Night fighters were experienced and effective. Even fast, low-observable targets could be engaged once detected, and the Ho-229 wasn't truly stealthy, just harder to detect. Moreover, strategic bombing campaigns require sustained operations with large numbers of aircraft. A few dozen Ho-229s conducting raids would be a nuisance, not a strategic threat. Germany would need hundreds of bombers conducting regular missions to significantly impact Allied operations. This was beyond German industrial and logistical capacity by 1944. The most realistic alternative history scenario is that an operational Ho-229 force would have been tactically effective but strategically irrelevant. German pilots would have achieved local successes. Allied bomber crews would have faced a new, challenging threat. Air combat over Germany would have been even more deadly for both sides. But Germany would still have lost the war. The Ho-229, however advanced, couldn't overcome the fundamental strategic realities. Overwhelming Allied industrial capacity, secure Allied logistics, multi-front pressure from American, British, and Soviet forces, and Germany's own resource constraints and industrial destruction. Advanced weapons can win battles. They rarely win wars, especially when the strategic fundamentals favor the other side. There's another alternative history scenario worth considering. What if the Horten brothers had been working for the Allies instead of Germany? Imagine if Reimar and Walter Horten had emigrated to Britain or America in the 1930s. Imagine if they'd proposed flying wing designs to the RAF or USAAF. Would their ideas have been accepted? Probably not, at least not initially. Allied air forces were conservative. They wanted proven designs, not experimental configurations. Jack Northrop struggled to get American interest in flying wings throughout the 1930s and 1940s, despite being an American citizen with an established company. The Horten brothers would have faced even more resistance as German immigrants proposing radical designs. They probably would have ended up working on conventional aircraft or in research roles. Their flying wing concepts shelved until the jet age made them relevant. This highlights an uncomfortable truth. Innovation often flourishes in desperate circumstances. Nazi Germany, facing overwhelming Allied advantages, was willing to gamble on unconventional weapons. The Allies, confident in their conventional superiority, had less incentive to pursue radical designs. The Ho-229 exists because Germany was losing and needed miracles. Ironically, this desperation created conditions where brilliant but unconventional ideas could be developed. In a different context, the Horten brothers might never have had the opportunity to build their jet-powered flying wing. March 2, 1945. Erwin Ziller dies in a field near Oranienburg. The Horten Ho-229V-2 prototype lies in burning wreckage. The dream of the jet-powered flying wing seems to die with it. But 75 years later, we can see that the dream didn't die. It evolved, it influenced, it inspired. The B-2 Spirit bomber flying over Afghanistan in the 2000s. The X-47B demonstrator landing on an aircraft carrier. The Northrop Grumman RQ-180 surveillance drone orbiting at the edge of space. All of them are descendants, in some way, of the radical black wing the Horten brothers created in a workshop in Nazi Germany. The Ho-229 story is ultimately about the persistence of ideas. Good engineering concepts don't die even when the regimes that produce them collapse. The flying wing configuration made aerodynamic sense in 1944. It makes sense in 2024. The fundamental physics haven't changed. But the story is also about timing and technology. The Horten brothers were ahead of their time. They had the vision and skill to design a jet-powered flying wing, but the technology to make it fully practical. Reliable jet engines, computer flight control systems, advanced materials wouldn't exist for decades. They were like Leonardo da Vinci sketching flying machines in the 15th century. The concepts were sound, the engineering was thoughtful, but the supporting technology to make it work didn't exist yet. Yet their work mattered. It proved the concept. It validated the configuration. It provided a foundation for later engineers to build on. The Ho-229 also reminds us that technology emerges from complex contexts. The aircraft was born from Nazi Germany's desperation, built using slave labor and scarce materials, intended to deliver bombs to civilian targets. We can't celebrate it without acknowledging this reality. But we can study it, we can learn from it, we can appreciate the engineering achievement while understanding the moral context. Technology itself is neutral. What matters is how we use it and why we create it. The Horten brothers were visionary engineers. They were also participants in a genocidal regime's war effort. Both things are true. History is rarely simple. Today, the Ho-229V-3 sits in the Smithsonian's Udvar-Hazy Center. Visitors walk beneath it, looking up at the smooth black wing, marveling at its futuristic appearance. School children learn about flying wing aerodynamics. Aerospace engineers study its design. History enthusiasts contemplate what might have been. The aircraft that was built to be a weapon has become a teacher. The prototype that never flew in combat now flies in imagination, inspiring new generations of engineers and aviation enthusiasts. Reimar and Walter Horten dreamed of flying wings from their youth. They pursued that dream through gliders, through war, through defeat, and into the post-war years. Reimar continued designing flying wings in Argentina. Walter consulted on aviation projects in Germany. Neither ever stopped believing in the flying wing concept. They lived long enough to know their work mattered. They saw the B-2 bomber program announced. They knew about stealth technology development. They understood that the radical ideas they'd pursued in the 1930s and 1940s had become mainstream by the 1990s. In one of his final interviews in 1993, Reimar Horten reflected on the Ho-229. We were trying to solve problems that wouldn't be fully solved for 50 years. We knew flying wings were the future. We just didn't have the technology to make them perfect. But we showed it could be done. That was enough. It was enough, because showing something can be done, even imperfectly, is sometimes all that's needed. The next generation of engineers can refine it. They can improve it. They can perfect it. That's how technology advances, not in sudden leaps, but in accumulated progress. Each generation builds on what came before. The Ho-229 was a step forward, a significant step, taken in dark circumstances, but a step nonetheless. And every B-2 that flies today, every flying wing drone that patrols the skies, carries a small piece of the Horton brothers' vision. The race for the jet age didn't end in 1945. It's still ongoing. Jets got faster, then supersonic, then hypersonic. Designs got more sophisticated, materials got stronger and lighter, control systems got smarter, but some principles remain constant. Reduce drag, integrate components efficiently, design for the mission. These were the Horton brothers' principles in 1944. They're still the principles aerospace engineers follow today. The Ho-229 was Hitler's flying wing, designed to serve a dying regime's desperate gamble. But it became humanity's flying wing, a contribution to aviation knowledge that transcended its origins. That's the final paradox of the Ho-229. It was created for the worst reasons, but represents some of humanity's best qualities: ingenuity, persistence, vision, and the drive to solve seemingly impossible problems. The smooth black wing hanging in the Smithsonian is a reminder of what humans can create when we apply our intelligence and skill. A reminder of how that creativity can serve both noble and terrible purposes. And a reminder that good ideas outlast bad regimes. 75 years after Erwin Ziller died in that field near Oranienburg, the Ho-229 still speaks to us. About the past, about what might have been, and about the future of aviation that the Horton brothers glimpsed but never lived to see fully realized. The race for the jet age continues. Flying wings are no longer radical experiments, they're operational reality. Stealth technology is proven, high-speed jet aircraft are commonplace. We won that race, humanity won that race, and two brothers from Bonn, Germany, obsessed with flying wings since their youth, helped show us the way. That's the legacy of the Horton Ho-229. Not a weapon that changed the war, not a superweapon that gave Nazi Germany victory, but an idea, a radical, brilliant, ahead-of-its-time idea that helped shape the future of flight. And that's worth remembering. If you want to see the Horton Ho-229 V3 for yourself, it's on permanent display at the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum's Stephen F. Udvar-Hazy Center in Chantilly, Virginia, near Washington Dulles Airport. The aircraft is suspended from the ceiling in the museum's main hangar, positioned as if in flight. It's displayed alongside other significant World War II aircraft: American, British, Japanese, and German. The Ho-229 holds its own among them, its sleek, futuristic profile standing out even among famous warbirds. Seeing it in person is revelatory. Photographs don't capture the scale or the smoothness of the lines. The wing sweep is more dramatic than pictures suggest. The integration of all components into the wing structure is more impressive when you can walk around and view it from different angles. Information panels explain the aircraft's history, the Horton brothers' story, and the technical innovations. The museum's treatment is balanced, acknowledging both the engineering achievement and the historical context of Nazi Germany's weapons development. The Ho-229 isn't the only captured German aircraft at Udvar-Hazy. The museum also displays an Arado R-234 jet bomber and a Heinkel He-219 night fighter, among others. But the Ho-229 is perhaps the most striking, the most radical in appearance, the most obvious glimpse into aviation's future. Visitors often spend significant time studying the Ho-229. Aerospace engineers examine the control surfaces and structural details. History buffs photograph it from every angle. Children ask their parents why it looks so different from other airplanes. It's become one of the museum's most popular exhibits, precisely because it challenges expectations. Most World War II aircraft look similar, conventional layouts with minor variations. The Ho-229 looks like it belongs in a science fiction movie, not a 1945 aircraft hangar. For aviation enthusiasts, the Ho-229 is a pilgrimage destination. It's one of the most significant aircraft that was never produced in quantity. It represents roads not taken, futures that might have been, and technologies ahead of their time. The Smithsonian Conservation Team continues to monitor the aircraft's condition. Wood and composite materials deteriorate over time, even in climate-controlled storage. Periodic inspections ensure the HO-229 remains stable and preserved for future generations. There's been occasional discussion of attempting to build a flying replica, a Ho-229 reproduction, using modern materials and engines, equipped with modern flight control systems to solve the stability problems that challenged the original. Several groups have proposed such projects over the years. None have come to fruition, largely due to cost and the complexity of recreating 1940s German construction techniques. But the idea persists. Imagine seeing a jet-powered flying wing, built to 1944 specifications but equipped with modern systems, actually flying. It would be a remarkable tribute to the Horton brothers' vision. Until that happens, if it ever does, the V3 prototype at Udvar-Hazy remains the closest most people will get to experiencing the Ho-229. And for aviation history, that's probably appropriate. The Ho-229 is a museum piece for good reasons. It represents a moment in time when technology and desperation intersected. It's a historical artifact that should be preserved and studied, not a design that should be reproduced and flown. But standing beneath it, looking up at the smooth black wing, you can imagine. Imagine Erwin Ziller climbing into the cockpit on March 2nd, 1945. Imagine the Jumo jet spooling up. Imagine that radical flying wing lifting into the sky over war-torn Germany. And you can wonder what might have happened if the program had continued. Wonder how aviation history might have unfolded differently. Wonder what the Horton brothers might have achieved if they'd had more time, more resources, and been working for different purposes. The Ho-229 invites imagination, it demands contemplation, and it rewards study. That's why it matters. Not because it changed the war, it didn't. Not because it was a superweapon, it wasn't. But because it represented possibility. The possibility of radical innovation. The possibility of technical excellence even in desperate circumstances. The possibility of glimpsing the future while trapped in the present. 75 years after its story ended in a burning field near Oranienburg, the Horton Ho-229 still flies. Not literally, but in inspiration, in influence, in the imaginations of everyone who sees it and wonders, what if? That's the power of visionary engineering. It transcends the moment of its creation. It outlives its creators. It influences generations that follow. The Horten brothers' flying wing was born in Nazi Germany's final desperate years. But it belongs to aviation history's entire timeline, connecting the past to the present and pointing toward the future. And that future, filled with flying wing stealth bombers, unmanned aerial vehicles, and aircraft configurations we haven't yet imagined, owes a debt to two brothers who dared to dream differently. The race for the jet age began with pioneers like the Horten brothers. It continues today with engineers pushing boundaries in new directions. And somewhere in that continuum, the Ho-229 sits suspended, literally in the Smithsonian, figuratively in aviation history, as a reminder of how far we've come and how much was glimpsed, even briefly, decades before we thought possible. Hitler's flying wing became humanity's lesson, about innovation, about persistence, about vision, and about the complex relationship between technology, context, and legacy. That's the story of the Horton Ho-229, a story that began with two brothers' dreams, passed through Nazi Germany's nightmare, and emerged into history as something more than either, a genuine contribution to human knowledge about flight. And that story continues, every time someone looks up at that black wing hanging in the Smithsonian and thinks incredible, beautiful, terrifying, brilliant, all true, all part of the same complex legacy. The Ho-229 isn't just an aircraft, it's a question, a challenge, an inspiration, and a warning. It asks, what else is possible? It challenges, push boundaries, take risks, think differently. It inspires, radical ideas can work, vision matters, persistence pays off. And it warns, technology serves human purposes, good or evil. Context matters, ethics matter. All of these lessons suspended in a smooth black wing, waiting for anyone willing to look up and learn. That's the final legacy of the Horton Ho-229. Not conquest, not victory, not terror from the skies, but knowledge, inspiration, and a glimpse of futures both dark and bright, depending on how we choose to use the technologies we create. The Horton brothers chose to build a flying wing. History chose what it would mean. We choose what lessons we draw from it, and the smooth black wing hangs there still, in a museum in Virginia, silent witness to all of it. Past, present, future. Hitler's flying wing, the Horton brothers' dream, humanity's inheritance. The race for the jet age continues. The Ho 229 showed us one possible path. We've taken it, adapted it, and made it our own. And somewhere, perhaps, Reimar and Walter Horton are watching, satisfied that their vision, born in gliders in the 1930s, refined through war in the 1940s, vindicated in the jet age, finally came to fruition. The flying wing flies, not as they built it, but as they imagined it. That's enough. That's legacy. That's history. The smooth black wing hangs suspended, forever frozen in flight, forever pointing toward tomorrow.